When we first started Agape, our concept was that we would have worship gatherings on Sunday, the Agape community meetings, and then Roots over the course of the week. And the Agape community meetings, Agape communities were focused on outreach, evangelism. Roots would be more discipleship focused. But we realized that there's this gap that in one respect the sermon, especially oriented towards moving the heart, challenging people, especially expositionally, might cause us to miss some important teachings, some important opportunities to take maybe tough topics or big theological topics and treat them. And initially the idea was that we would have 3 weekenders a year, and a weekender is like what we're doing right now, Friday night, Saturday morning, nothing too complicated. And the typical, when we've only maybe done it twice, where we've finished an entire year doing a weekender, 2013, 2014, we may have pulled it off, where we focused in the wintertime on the heart, and the late spring, early summer on the hands, and then in September, October on the head. So heart, hands, mind, however you want to say it. And so we actually do get an opportunity to have Joel come and tell us a bit about something that should affect the heart, revival and Christian history. I did want to tell you, over the years we've tried to bring in professors, but we also have had different people that are really strong in a particular topic come in. And Joel, as you all know, he has good credentials, strong credentials. That's a good way to put it. His good credentials out there. And at the end of the day, he's put a lot of effort and energy into learning a lot about church history. And for this weekender, he gets to benefit us. So, let's do, even though he's well known to you all, let's give him a hand and say thank you for your effort.
So Jeremiah is basically just saying Joel's a nerd and we need to make him feel good by letting him talk for a while. Which I approve of that, so sounds good.
Everything's true except I don't need to make you feel good. I want to hear what you had to say.
I appreciate that. Cool. So yeah, like Jeremiah said, we're going to be talking tonight and tomorrow morning about, is this recording? About revival in church history. And I hope over the course of this time that you, learn something new, something that you haven't seen before, maybe something that challenges something that you thought, something that makes you look at the way that God works in history and the world in maybe a little bit of a different way. And ultimately that turns our hearts to praise Him more, turns our hearts to pray for Him to continue doing great works in the times in which we live, and then kind of going out and being the kinds of people that He calls us to be. So with that, got a little bit of introduction, and then we will do a little bit of a break, get some cobbler and ice cream, come back, and then we'll do a little bit more content for the rest of the night. So, okay. So yeah, goals, 3 of them. Understand revival as a concept throughout church history. What is revival? Would maybe be that first question. Second, to provide some context, some historical context, and some tools, some frameworks for thinking about revivals in the past, present, and then as our lives unfold, as we see God continuing to work, how do we think about revival and what He's doing? And then third, to encourage prayer, like I said, for God's continued work in our own time. So the agenda tonight, we're going to be looking at what is revival, some conceptual groundwork, talking about what is this we're talking about. Then we'll do a first case study, Second Great Awakening, which my guess is if you are familiar with the idea of revival in history, this is probably something that you've heard of, maybe something that you've studied a bit before, thinking about that. And then I've got 2 case studies that likely for a lot of us are a little outside of the normal realm of what we think of when we think of revival. The first being St. Francis of Assisi and the Franciscan reforms of the 13th century. So this is a pre-Reformation movement. This is before Martin Luther and these others came along, talking about would this fit a category of revival? Would this fit within our understanding of what we think about when we think of revival? And then the second one being the Azusa Street Revival of 1906, which is kind of known as the birth of global Pentecostalism, which is one of the fastest growing Christian movements in the world, accounts for between 300 and 600 million people in the world today. So these, like I said, are maybe two topics that you're not quite as familiar with, and I think tomorrow is going to be a little bit more discussion-oriented. We're going to do a little bit of reading together. I'll have some printouts for us to do, to think a little bit more critically and carefully about what does it look like to think about God working in contexts we're less familiar with, which then I hope will allow us to then think about our own context with a little more clarity as well. So with that, also, before I get there, if you have any questions at any point, something sticks out to you, something doesn't make sense, you want clarity, if I show something on the screen that I don't explain, just raise your hand, shout out, whatever. This does not need to be super formal. I like discussion, interrupt, whatever you want to do. If you find that I am incorrect in saying something, you fact check me and I have said something false, just tell me. I don't want to say things that aren't correct, and I'm sure at some point I probably will. So please do that. And yeah, let's jump in. So what do you think of when you think of the term revival?
An awakening of faith.
Awakening of faith.
Large group of people.
Okay. Yeah.
Like working in some way distinct from how he has been working.
Mm-hmm.
Big tents,
Big tents. Yeah. Big tent.
altar calls.
Altar calls. Yeah. Yeah. For context, this is a picture of the Asbury Awakening Revival movement that happened about a year ago. There's a lot of debate. Is this a revival? Is this not? We saw kind of for one of the first times the intersection of social media and the internet with some of this. So some of these questions, what is revival, were definitely live on the internet a few months back. So yeah, so we've got lots of people, God working in a new way, big tents, working in an unexpected way. Anything else? Awakening of faith.
So people expect some sort of like rekindling of feelings for God for revivals.
Yeah. Yeah. Feeling. Yeah, I think that's a good word to use.
Yeah, like a lot more consecrated time for a corporate worship gathering.
Mm-hmm. Like an extended worship service or
And
something.
usually getting in, your most like in your face preacher, if you can do that.
Mm-hmm.
That's at least a Southern Baptist small town thing.
Yeah.
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 I think of like revival, trying to come back to the essence of Christianity. So like
Mhm.
trying to some of the basics and a call to a pure Christianity.
Well, I think those are all really helpful, good answers. And part of the point of tonight and this conceptual groundwork is to say we're not going to define exactly what revival is. We're going to leave that as a question throughout our time. What is revival? What do we think about being the marks of a revival? And I'm going to give a couple of kind of tentative marks or features of revival and a working definition for us. But as we go along, that's why at the bottom of your sheets I've put what is revival as a question, because I think that's something for us to be thinking about throughout.
And Michelle or Grant, do you have any extra pens for people?
Yeah, we have a bunch.
Okay. So if you need a pen, let me know. I
Michelle
was one of
says
those.
some might not work, but keep trying until you find one.
Okay. So first thing that I think is important to foreground is the question, is revival a modern concept? So this is a graph of the Google Ngram, which is just basically all of the books in Google Books, the online scan of essentially they try to scan every book that exists. And the times that the word revival shows up across time. So we can see in the 1700, very, very infrequently is it used. It rises across the 1700s, is very frequent throughout the 1800s, maybe a little bit of a drop, but it kind of remains a part of the English language up through the present. That being said, and I think it's helpful to think about revival, like the term being modern, but I don't think that it's just the only thing that people are talking about when they think about the concept of revival. So words that other people have used throughout time: new, fresh work of God, outpouring of the Spirit, reform, renewal, revitalization, awakening. And the working definition I would propose for us, just off from the start, is a pronounced deepening of religious feeling and expression. It's pretty bare bones, pretty basic. I think it can encompass a lot of these other things we're talking about. And ultimately, I hope we explore a little bit more of what of those other things fits well. The other question is revival in the Bible? The term itself, not really, in terms of a direct translation, but the idea, I think, the way that people a lot of use it certainly is. So we can think of when King David brings the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem and there's dancing in 2 Samuel. We can think of King Josiah's reforms when he pulls the Torah, the scrolls, out of the temple and tries to get Israel back in order as a revival of renewed emphasis on following God. In the New Testament, obviously Pentecost would be a kind of obvious candidate for a revival. Philip preaching in Samaria and seeing a lot of conversions there in Acts 8, and then Paul in Ephesus, which as we go throughout Ephesians, we'll read and hear a little bit more about what exactly happens when Paul is in Ephesus. But there's a big movement among the people, a lot of conversions, a lot of people turning away from idols, turning away from false gods, and turning to follow Christ. So these, when we think about movements that God has done throughout history, these are foregrounding a lot of that. Like when we see a new movement of God in our time, we're probably going to look back at these texts and others to kind of gauge our understanding. So have Christians throughout Christian history looked to the scriptures to get an understanding and a framework for how we think about the way God's working. So I have 4 general features of revival in church history that I think we'll see throughout our time. First, revivals come in a variety of shapes and sizes. 2, they often accentuate aspects of the Christian faith that were felt to be neglected at the time. So maybe prayer is being neglected. You might see a movement of prayer. People saying, we got to get back to pray. Or maybe corporate singing is in neglect. We need to get together and we need to sing together. Maybe giving to the poor is neglected. So on and so forth. Third, revivals often occur during times of societal change and upheaval. If we look across history, oftentimes people have a renewed spiritual hungering when there's a lot changing around them, when things feel unsettling, when there might be natural disasters, political conflicts, wars, things like that. And then fourth, revivals are almost always controversial. And I wonder if, as you think back on times you've heard people talk about revival, people being very gung-ho, and then at the same time meeting someone who is very much a naysayer. There are a couple of terms that scholars of religion like to use for this, and that is the new lights versus the old lights, or the new school versus the old school. And as we look at revivals throughout history, this dynamic is almost always at play when we think about a movement of God. There's almost always someone who is, often somewhat cautiously, but very optimistic about the way that God is working and the way that things are moving in the time. And then you might have the old lights who are saying, this is not legitimate, we need to wait and see that this is going to pan out to see if this is actually a real revival. 2 kind of quintessential examples in American history, and on that chart that I showed of the use of the term revival, these 2 kind of operated right at the beginning of before the term revival started to rise. So these were 2 Puritan ministers in the early 1700s in New England. Charles Chauncey was pastor in Boston. Jonathan Edwards was pastor in Connecticut, later was at Yale for a while, and he is kind of known as the last of the Puritans or the first of the evangelicals. So he's at this kind of interesting point, especially in American history, about how we think about revival, and they both, importantly for our topic, were operating at a time that was the beginning of the First Great Awakening, as it's known. At the time, it was not known as First Great Awakening because the Second Great Awakening had not happened. And as we get into the Second Great Awakening tonight, we can also talk about whether they should be separate, whether it's one continuous thing, whether there's multiple different ones throughout that. Historians like to debate when things begin and end because time is continuous. There's not clear markers. But for our purposes, Jonathan Edwards and Charles Chauncey fit a very helpful role in helping frame this kind of old light, new light controversy. Anybody know who the new light is in this?
Yep.
Jonathan, yes. Jonathan Edwards, he's the new light. Charles Chauncey is the old light. You wouldn't know from their faces. Yeah, they're both a little stoic.
Chauncey was grouchier though.
Chauncey might, he might, he's a little older in this picture, I think. And maybe the book is giving something away. But these two at the time wrote a lot. One of the things that Jonathan Edwards is most well known for is what is called a faithful narrative of the surprising work of God and I'm not going to read the rest of the title because it keeps going. But faithful narrative is the shorthand for this. So this was written in 1737 when Jonathan Edwards, who you might have heard of Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which is probably the most famous sermon ever preached in America, and is widely known by historians to have started the First Great Awakening. So Jonathan Edwards, who is himself a scholar, a very learned man, he sees all of these people having conversions, and he seems to think God is working in a new way. And so he's writing letters, and the faithful narrative is a kind of formalized version of a letter he originally wrote to a pastor. And this gets sent back to England, actually, to tell of what is happening in New England, to say, wow, God is doing something new in New England. It's great. You should believe this. But he gives some cautions, we got to wait and see some things. But he's generally pretty optimistic. Charles Chauncey writes Seasonable Thoughts on the State of Religion in New England, a treatise in 5 parts, and the title keeps going, which is essentially, this is about 10-ish years later. This is written against the First Great Awakening, against what Jonathan Edwards is championing. He's saying, whoa. There's a whole lot of newfangled stuff going on here. There's a lot of religious enthusiasm is the term that he would use. A lot of emotional sentiments that are being garnered up in people. But we don't want to say that this is necessarily a work of God. We need to wait and see. We need to hold our horses, let God work in the normal ways that he does, and then we'll see what happens. So he's kind of writing against what's going on in the Great Awakening. So here's kind of an example of what Edwards would say. This seems to have been a very extraordinary dispensation of providence. God has in many respects gone out of and much beyond his usual and ordinary way. The work in this town and some others about us has been extraordinary on account of the universality of it all, affecting all sorts, sober, vicious, high and low, rich and poor, wise and unwise. The church was very large before, but persons never thronged into it as they did in the late extraordinary time. I am far from pretending to be able to determine how many have been the subjects of such mercy, but if I may be allowed to declare anything that appears to me probable in a thing of this nature, I hope that more than 300 souls were savingly brought home to Christ in this town in the space of half a year. And this is New England. There's not huge populations. 300 is a pretty good size for a small New England town in the 1700s. So that's 1737. 1743, Charles Chauncey replies, there was never a time in this land when there was so much flocking after some particular ministers and glorying in them as though they were gods rather than men. Never a time wherein men's professions and affections rose higher. Never a time wherein conversions, numerous conversions, were so much boasted of. Would to God that there was no reason to doubt the truth of any of them. But it ought always to be remembered that there may be a very specious show where there is not the substance of religion. Nor are persons without danger of resting in the former to the neglect of the latter. And it may be feared whether this danger hasn't been greatly increased, while so many have been encouraged to look upon themselves as in a state of grace, without that proof of the reality of their conversion, which might reasonably be expected. There's certainly been too much haste, as well as positiveness, in declaring these and those, and this and that other place, to have passed from death to life. A judgment has been too commonly formed of men's spiritual condition. Now, I wonder after reading those, if when we were reading Edwards, you thought, yeah, those are some good points. And then as you're reading Chauncey, you also think, well, those are also some pretty good points. And I think that's the point that I'm getting at, is that when it comes to revivals, when it comes to the works of God, they're complicated. And the way that we think about them is going to differ person to person necessarily, of how we ourselves are brought up, where we're at in our stage of life, what our context is. And so as we think about these revivals, I think the new light, old light is a helpful way of thinking about where in this, when I think about this revival, am I an old light or am I a new light? because the new light is typically the person who happens to be more at the center of whatever movement's happening, and the old light happens to be one who's maybe a little more on the periphery. Or maybe the old light is the one who happens to disagree with a particular theological point that's being emphasized now. And in a couple of years, maybe there'll be a new light for a particular movement in the opposite direction. But this dynamic happens throughout history. Our second session is actually the Second Great Awakening. But before we jump into that, I want to do a quick poll based off of our last session. Raise your hand if you, being honest with yourself, are more of a new light. Just thinking about your own temperament, your own assumptions. Would you consider yourself more of a new light?
In general.
In general, just not about a particular moment, not a particular movement, just in general.
No wonder I feel so.
Jeremiah's a new.
Wait, what did I miss?
Right?
I don't know what
I'm-
that is. Oh, re-explain the word. She was
Okay,
here for it.
are
I
you
don't know what that means.
are you more of a new light or okay?
I missed
Here,
it.
here.
I was
This-
being a baby.
This should. Are you more like this guy or this guy? Just kidding. No. So yeah, the idea is that as we approach different revivals and thinking about them, there's kind of usually a new light group or the new school, people who are very pro the revival, very optimistic about what's happening, and then the old lights who are a little more hesitant. Cynical is maybe a little too strong of a word, but sometimes applies.
When you heard about Asbury, were you instinctively like, "Oh, that's great," or you're more like, "I don't know about them. Those are Methodists."
Well put. Yes. So that's the idea of old light, new light. So we got a couple of new lights. Does that mean we got a lot of old lights in the house as well?
I hate change.
Okay. All right. That would be an old light characteristic. Yeah. Brandon also brought up a question a couple minutes ago that I think is helpful to think about when it comes to revival, and is the idea of group versus individual. So I think when we talk about revival, sometimes we can focus a lot on big group things, big tent revival, big movements of a lot of people. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that in these movements are a whole bunch of individual Christians who are seeking to follow Jesus, who are experiencing God in new ways in their own lives, people who are converting, people who are coming to a new and stronger understanding.
I just want to clarify. Did I actually see that it was just me and Craig that raised our hands for the new lights?
We hadn't seen lights.
I would
I would
say, like,
consider
medium.
myself a little more of a new light.
Medium light?
Yeah. Like dim.
I was like,
Everything's dark.
All right, so we get this is, and it's we're not even Presbyterian.
no, I mean we might as well be.
Yeah. Anyways, so this idea of individuals and groups are happening at the same time. And often when we think about revivals, we're looking for that one moment that sparked everything, or that one moment where everything changed. And sometimes we can get at that. Other times it's a little more chaotic, and it's hard to find an exact starting point or ending point of some of these things. And that's part of the messiness of history. And I think one thing that I also want to note is at least when I look into church history, something that stands out to me is a friend of mine who became a Christian while I was studying my master's and joined the Bible study that I was in. He also was studying history and studying kind of early modern 1600s, 1700s history and focusing on the church. And I said, well, Adion, this is pretty cool because now all of this homework you've been doing is now family history. And I think that is something that I think is really exciting about studying history is that we are studying our family. We're studying people who have come generations before us and all the messiness. Each one of us in our own family, personal family histories, it's very messy. It's very great. There's awesome things that we want to emulate. There's some things that we look at and we're like, I'm not so sure. And I think the same applies when we think about the family history that we are a part of, because the church is not perfect yet. We'll be made perfect by Christ when we all meet Him new in the new creation, but that's something to keep in mind as well as we do this. Yeah, so anyways, Second Great Awakening, about 1800 to about 1840. This is one of those where finding an exact starting point is pretty hard. Finding an exact ending point, pretty hard, although you would be hard-pressed to find any historian who would say that it lasted beyond the Civil War in the 1860s. That's a pretty sharp break in what's going on here. But yeah, about 1800 to 1840. So to give a little bit of historical context, I was watching a documentary a couple months back, and the historian was saying the founding of America is so mythologized in the way that Americans view it as part of their own history that it's kind of hard to get a little bit of historical distance from it. Everything seems extremely freighted with meaning. And so that's something just for us to keep in mind as people who live in the United States to think about with this history, is that it's history just like it is the history of the UK or Germany or Australia or Brazil or whatever. It's a period, and it doesn't have to have a ton of freight loaded to it as we think about it. But at the time that the Second Great Awakening is happening, about 1800s, early 1800s, you've got the growing pains of a new nation. Here's an example of some of those growing pains. This is War of 1812. British set the White House on fire. Not going great. But also, America is coming into its own. It's figuring out what do all of these disparate states do as they come together and form a new nation. You have the expansion of the western frontier. Here is a map kind of showing some of the routes and the new states and territories that were created, pushing Native Americans along. You can see this map actually includes a map of the Trail of Tears as well, which was a big event during this time period, very sad. Which, fun fact for you, a lot of the Native Americans who were pushed back were Presbyterians. They already converted to Christianity, and we still ship them off to Oklahoma. No, that's a fun fact. That was sad fact. Sad, not fun. This Andrew Jackson is kind of a representative of the populism of the time. Populism being kind of a ground swelling of the everyday man, the everyday woman, well, mainly everyday man at the time, getting active in politics, famously very kind of uneducated, backwoods kind of guy who becomes president. You also have ongoing debates about slavery. So slave trade was still legal at the beginning of this period, becomes illegal in the early 1800s, and then during the antebellum period before the Civil War. This is an ongoing struggle, not just politically, but also between churches. This becomes a really big inflection point and a lot of tension within churches, within denominations, throughout the time period. You also have a lot of economic change happening due to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So this is an example of the first mill in Lowell, Massachusetts, or the first textile mill, which became a burgeoning industry in New England, and it really changed the way that Americans lived. It changed economic growth patterns, the way that everyday people, the kinds of goods that they were able to afford, all sorts of things changed during this period. And yeah, so that's, like I said, a lot going on, things to keep in mind. I could have mentioned hundreds of other different things, but these things are helpful to keep in mind as we think about the Great Awakening. Now, historians, when they talk about the Second Great Awakening, they often kind of put it into three different categories. First, being the first 10 years or so, these are frontier camp meetings. So these are a lot of Methodists formed by John and Charles Wesley over in the British Isles, who then bring over their faith to New England and kind of through the middle colonies and spread very rapidly across the frontier. So a lot of this is happening in Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, a lot of where Jeremiah's family lives. This is kind of the heartland of that period of the Second Great Awakening. The second phase for the next 15 years or so is led by a lot of New Englanders in congregational churches. So you have people who are operating at divinity schools like Yale Divinity School, Harvard Divinity School to a lesser extent. And this is a little more of a kind of academic or higher class, as some historians would say, conservative phase of the Reformation or the revival. And then the last 15 or so years can kind of be summed up by one guy, Charles Grandison Finney, in the sense that he represents an ongoing fervor for what comes to be derogatorily termed revivalism rather than revival. And we'll talk a little bit about that debate that's happening, because he introduces some new measures, some new ways of doing things, many of which are actually the things that when we first said what we think about revival, we said are things that at the time he was introducing that were new and very controversial. So again, a couple of key features: extended camp meetings. with a focus on conversion. This is where conversion becomes a big part of the parlance of evangelicals and Protestants throughout the United States and the British Isles.
And you transition to revivalism in these? Or this is the revival?
This is that's a good question. Yeah, it's not entirely clear, and I think it depends on where people land on that. But having like a revival service, for example, that kind of starts during this period. The idea of hosting an event specifically to spur on revival, that is birthed during this period for sure. And Finney is kind of a leader during that. But yeah, so these extended camp meetings, these are kind of out in the frontier lands. A lot of people who are Christians at the time don't have maybe a home church because things are moving very quickly as they settle farms. They're very far from a town. And so they would gather together. This is led a lot by Methodists, a lot by Baptists as well, as they filter into the Ohio River Valley. And they're hosting these camp meetings where there's going to be a lot of preaching, there's going to be a lot of prayer. So again, there's a lot of strong emphasis on preaching, led by circuit riders. These are pastors who would go from town to town on a horse, sometimes riding thousands of miles. I forget the exact number, but someone calculated based off of his journals how many miles Charles Wesley had ridden across the British Isles, and it was in the multiple thousands of miles, that going back and forth over and over and over again to places. He's a very busy man.
His booty must have hurt.
That or it just got used to it. I don't know.
Was he back?
Horseback. What? Yeah.
He wasn't like full leg.
No. He's on horseback. No. So these are not wealthy people getting pulled in a cart. These are like very poor itinerant preachers who have a Bible in their overcoat and they're on horseback, riding through the middle of nowhere to get to the next town or next camp meeting. This is also a time when a lot of female preachers start becoming prominent in a lot of denominations. It operated for a lot of times outside of formal denominational structures, so this was something pretty significant. Before this time, if you were preaching, you were typically just within a kind of ordained ministerial position. This in the First Great Awakening, there's a little bit less of that formal division, but a lot of these things are outside of an official denomination sponsoring it. And you actually see a lot of instances where Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Baptists, Methodists are all gathering together in one camp meeting and celebrating the unity of the Spirit in those moments. There's also a significant shift away from a kind of classic Calvinism to Arminianism. You have a lot of the Presbyterian church is a big debate at that time over whether or not traditional kind of 5-point tulip Calvinism, as we learned this past Sunday, was what Christians or Presbyterians specifically should hold to in their theology. It's the time of the rise of the Baptists and Methodists, so there's a reason why if you travel across Ohio and Indiana, in every single small town you visit, there's going to be a little white Methodist church, likely, because that's where the Methodists settled. And if you drive across North, South Carolina into Georgia, there's going to be a Baptist church at about every single corner. This is the time when those denominations, relative to the Anglicans or Episcopalians and the Presbyterians, used to be the kind of leading denominations. Baptists and Methodists kind of take over for most of this period. And this is also a time when there is a lot of millenarianism, which is a fancy term for end times. Part of this, I think, has to do with some of those significant societal changes that were happening at the time. But it's a time when people are expecting that there's going to be the end time. Jesus is coming back soon. We're witnessing all of these new ways he's pouring out the Spirit. They can start to fill in the blanks of the way Scripture talks about some of the end times, and they think, all right, we're getting close. So those are some key features. I've got a couple pictures here. This is a woodcutting kind of portraying a typical camp meeting. So people would go out and stay for several days. I know, it's sad. They would go out and actually camp, and they would be gathered in these large groups, and they would hear hours and hours of preaching, a lot of singing, a lot of collective prayer, just gathering together, waiting for God to move in a mighty way. Here is a typical example of a circuit rider. I don't know if their hats always look that nice, but
Is he wearing makeup?
he may be, but yeah.
Going
So
to conference?
Yeah, going conference. So the Methodists would host they call it conference, is where their synods would meet together, the pastors would gather. But yeah, so that would be a circuit rider. Here is an example of, there were kind of two hot spots of areas where the revivals were happening. Like I said, here in the kind of Kentucky, North Carolina, Tennessee region is where a lot of revival happened. People were pouring in over the Appalachian Mountains, forming farms, things like that, clearing the woods, getting settled there. People also, remember at the time, rivers were your kind of main highways, so they're coming down the Ohio River into this area, so all along the Ohio River, along here you're going to see that. And then up in the northeast, and this is kind of a little bit more of that second and third wave of the revival, is what is termed the burned over district, in part because there was a lot of hellfire and brimstone preaching happening in that part of New York, and so it was termed the termed the burn over district. But there is a lot of activity happening out there in western New York, and as we'll see later, a few other developments that came out of that area as well. So a couple of key figures. On the left here we have Barton Stone. He was a frontier preacher. We'll hear a little bit more from him about the Cane Ridge Revival, which happened in Kentucky. He was a Presbyterian who later, as he kind of went along, began to flout some of these denominational boundaries, kind of preached in Baptist, Methodist churches, kind of all over the place. The second guy is more representative of that second phase of the revival movement. That's Lyman Beecher. So Lyman Beecher, he was the president of Yale College at the time. He taught at the Divinity School. He was a leading theologian. Also father of Harriet Beecher Stowe. And and so he was a leading abolitionist during the early 1800s. Third person is, my guess, probably none of you have ever heard of her. Her name is Jarena Lee. She was the first female preacher in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was a new denomination that sprung out of the Second Great Awakening. Because in the Second Great Awakening, a lot of slaves were encouraged to participate in some of these things. Now, there was still a lot of segregation, slavery was still obviously happening, but because of this, a lot of new, specifically African American denominations sprang out of this time. The African Methodist Episcopal Church being one of those. Still operates to this day. They hold to many of the things that the Methodist Church historically held to, but is primarily an African American black denomination. And then the fourth guy on the end there, his name is Charles Grandison Finney. He was known for having a piercing gaze. I think this picture captures it fairly well. Probably one of the most famous people of the 1800s in the United States. And he did a lot of his preaching up there in that back country of New York, the western New York area, but also then, as he gained fame, as he gained prominence, preached in a lot of the main cities along the east coast of the United States. Go for it.
Was there a challenge with people of the faith of the blending of pastors from different denominations preaching in two other denominations, and was it a cult of personality more than it was, man, you've got Finney here and got this Methodist guy over here, Baptist guy. It seems like it'd be more like a cult of personality rather than it is a collective faith.
Kind of like what Chauncey was saying about
Yes,
people
right.
searching
I
after
feel like
people.
old
Yes,
lights.
that definitely is operating there. Absolutely. People, if Finney is coming to your town, you're not going to miss it. You're going to go see him. You're going to go watch him preach. If Barton Stone is hosting a camp meeting like within 100 miles, you're probably going to pack your family up and you're going to go check out what's happening. So that's definitely happening. In terms of the cross-denominational conflict, to an extent, I think it kind of depends on the setting. In some of the early camp meetings, it seems not to be as big of a deal because they're not getting into some of the particularities of the faith. They're kind of more generally just gathered for prayer, and there's a lot of overlap in that. But definitely you would see tension. So someone like Charles Hodge, who was a Presbyterian, very, very much a kind of old school, old light professor at Princeton Seminary, very much kind of traditional Calvinist theologian. He doesn't really like what's going on here. And he talks a lot about how people just going out without the sanction of any denomination and preaching wherever is kind of disorderly. It's not good. And so he doesn't like that whatever Baptist preacher is just showing up into the middle of wherever and preaching. So that definitely is a debate. Yeah. Any question here? No. Cool. Did that address your questions? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, that definitely was a conflict in some instances. Although, yeah, in others, like when you read about some of the eyewitness accounts of the camp meetings, part of what they're emphasizing is the unity felt in the Spirit.
Were there marked differences between, say, Presbyterian and Baptist lines
Yes.
of demarcation?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, certainly baptism being one prominent example of that. I do think the Calvinism Arminianism separation becomes pretty prominent here as well. So you have a lot of people who are very distinctively a free will Baptist versus like a Calvinistic Presbyterian. That becomes an issue between some of these as well. Yeah, especially as you get to when Finney is talking about methods to encourage revival, and a more Calvinistic Presbyterian is going to say, whoa, no, that's up to God to do that movement. You can't, make this happen. You can't make a work of God happen. So that does become a kind of issue as well. So, yeah.
Thanks.
So those are a few key figures. Like I said, there's a lot of other people who are preaching, a lot of backwoods country preachers that you and I will never know their names, but probably preach to thousands and thousands of people over the course of their lifetime, going from town to town, being circuit riders, things like that. If you want to hear about why Hoosiers are called Hoosiers, I can tell that story another time. But it has something to do with this period. I like to think it does. It's not definitive proof, but anyways. So this is a kind of quintessential example of a camp meeting. And this is probably, one theologian calls it the most important religious event in the 1800s in the United States. And so this happens in what is literally Kentucky. I googled the spot where the original meeting house for this camp meeting was, and it is like in the middle of like dark green, a couple 100 miles away from a city. It's in the middle of nowhere. But at the time, between 20 and 30,000 people showed up to this middle of nowhere camp meeting in Kentucky. That was a collection of Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, all sorts of people gathering together for a prayer meeting. And this is a portrayal of that meeting with our friend Barton Stone there in the middle preaching. So Barton Stone fortunately left us an eyewitness account of this in his biography, which, given that he was a leading proponent in it, is going to give a little more of an optimistic take on it. But I think as we get into some of this, you'll see, I think he's pretty good at giving us some context of what's going on. So he describes, towards the beginning of the century, that apathy in religious societies appeared everywhere to an alarming degree. Not only the power of religion had disappeared, but also the very form of it was waning fast away, and continued so till the beginnings of the present century. And so this is someone who recognized that things were not going so well in the church, and we needed some revival. On the 2nd of July, 1801, I was married to Elizabeth Campbell, daughter of Colonel William Campbell, and Tabitha's wife, daughter of General William Russell of Virginia. My companion was pious and much engaged in religion. Right after he gets married, we hurry up to from Muhlenberg, where her mother lived, to be in readiness for a great meeting to commence at Cane Ridge shortly after. This memorable meeting came on Thursday or Friday before the third Lord's Day in August 1801. The roads were literally crowded with wagons, carriages, horsemen, and footmen moving to the solemn camp. The sight was affecting. It was judged by military men on the ground that there were between 20 and 30,000 collected. And he's not the only one who reports that it was at least that high. Some historians say maybe it was closer to 10 to 20. It was a lot of people for the middle of nowhere in Kentucky at the time. 4 or 5 preachers were frequently speaking at the same time in different parts of the encampment without confusion. The Methodist and Baptist preachers aided in the work, and all appeared cordially united in it, of one mind and one soul, and the salvation of sinners seemed to be of the great object of all. We all engaged in singing the same songs of praise, all united in prayer, and all preached the same things, free salvation urged upon all by faith and repentance. So here this captures some of the sentiment that was happening. People were seeking salvation of sinners. They were seeking repentance. They were preaching the gospel of faith. And they were doing so united with other Christians with whom on a Sunday morning they might have previously been divided. The numbers converted will be known only in eternity. Many things transpired there which were so much like miracles that if they were not, they had the same effects as miracles on infidels and unbelievers. For many of them by these were convinced that Jesus was the Christ and bowed in submission to him. This meeting continued 6 or 7 days and nights and would have continued longer, but provisions for such a multitude failed in the neighborhood. And apparently they didn't have someone to give 4,000 or 5,000 people's worth of food to them. So, I don't know. Then it really, he would have had very little doubt that there was a miracle. But again, this is an example of someone who is very optimistic about the revival, is very optimistic about what's happening. And he's also like, maybe it was a miracle, maybe there were miracles, maybe not. Whatever the case, people were saved. People came to know the Lord Jesus. And that was the most important thing to him in this moment. And that's why I pulled out this quote, because I thought it really stood out to me, that he had a bit of a sober mind about some of the conflicts and some of the naysayers. He said, yeah, whatever, but I know God is working. I know that people came to know Jesus in this. Now, I had to throw these in because I thought these were really interesting. When we think about camp meetings, maybe you think of kind of sitting together very quietly, singing Kumbaya. It's maybe a little more somber. Sometimes that's the case. Other times it gets a little rowdier. And Barton Stone gives us a pretty good examples of how that rowdiness manifests. The bodily agitations or exercises attending the excitement in the beginnings of the century were various and called by various names, as the falling exercise, the jerks, the dancing exercise, and the barking exercise, the laughing and singing exercise, etc. The falling exercise is very common among all classes, the saints and sinners of every age and of every grade, from the philosopher to the clown. The object of this exercise would generally, with a piercing scream, fall like a log on the floor, earth, or mud, and appear as dead. So these are people who, for whatever reason during this time, they're slain in the spirit. Exactly. Which becomes a term in about 100 years after this. But yeah, absolutely. So that's one example. The running exercise, I thought, oh wait, we've got the jerks first. Jerks cannot be as easily described. Sometimes the subject would be affected in some one member of the body, and sometimes in the whole system. When the head alone was affected, it would be jerked backward and forward, or from side to side so quickly the features of the face could not be distinguished. When the whole system was affected, I've seen the person stand in one place and jerk backward and forward in quick succession, their head nearly touching the floor behind and before.
What?
All classes, saints and sinners, the strong as well as the weak, were thus affected. So I'll just leave that one there.
And I'll try it.
It's a yeah. If you can touch your head backwards and forward, I would believe you got a Holy Spirit or something. I don't know.
We're just not as flexible as they used to be.
That's true. Maybe they did stretching exercises. They did calisthenics before these revivals. I don't know.
I tried that earlier.
It didn't work. Yeah. Then he was really slain in the spirit. Anyways. The running exercise was another interesting one. It was nothing more than the person feeling something of these bodily agitations through fear attempted to run away and thus escape from them. But it commonly happened they did not run far before they fell or became so greatly agitated they could proceed no further. I knew a young physician of a celebrated family who came some distance to a big meeting to see the strange things he heard of. He and a young lady had sportively agreed to watch over and take care of each other if either should fall. At length, the physician felt something very uncommon and started from the congregation to run into the woods. He was discovered running as for life, but did not proceed far till he fell down, and there lay till he submitted to the Lord, and afterwards became a zealous member of the church. Such cases were common. And while I think sometimes these exercises, especially doing them from a distance, seem a little crazy, a little fantastical, maybe I'm alone, but I think there are times when I feel an angst about something God's trying to tell me, and I just want to get out. I just want to go run. I just want to, no, don't try to call me to do that. And maybe it's not exactly what's happening here, but I like to think that a little bit of what I experience in that is what some of these people might have been experiencing as well.
I mean, just to jump in a little bit.
Yeah.
I've witnessed in
All three of
Africa. Well, I've not witnessed
I
one
witnessed all
exercise.
three.
I have witnessed the first two, and it's unrelated, right? These are people who would not have known about the history of these kinds of things, experiencing the jerks and the falling one, the being slain of the
The
spirit.
falling exercise.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, and if we cover anything in this that you're like, oh, that reminds me of X, please shout out. Yeah, absolutely. So the running exercise. Now we'll get into some of the controversies. Like I said, in part because of some of these exercises, in part because of some of this interdenominational mixture of things, there are some controversies that came with the Second Great Awakening. Like I said before, this is a time period where people start to debate, is this revival or is this revivalism? Kind of starts as a derogatory term, talking about people who are manufacturing revival. And this, in large part, comes as a result of Charles Grandison Finney, his new measures, as they were called. And he embraced the term as such, as some new measures. And he specifically published this book here, Lectures on Revivals of Religion, which is a really fascinating book. If you want a copy of anything I reference in here, I got PDFs of all of it, so I can just send you whatever. I wanted to have a nice bibliography with stuff that I could send out, and I ran out of time. So that I could get that to you like next week. But this is a really interesting case study of how people were thinking about what it meant to have a revival. And so we'll get into what some of these new measures are. But people start to debate, are these legitimate ways of trying to have a true revival of religion or not? Or is this just for show? Is this just creating a machine that gets people to make emotional decisions without really being the work of the Spirit? There's also a lot of debates about Calvinism. So our friend Barton Stone from Cane Ridge, he said in that same account, the same book, that Calvinism is among the heaviest clogs in Christianity in the world. Charles Grandison Finney, likewise, was a fairly staunch opponent of a traditional Calvinism, despite being the most famous Presbyterian pastor in the 1800s in America. And specifically talking about how, in their view, the traditional theology of Calvinism put a damper on the ability to do some of these new measures, to instigate or bring about revival amongst people. And I'm not going to take a stance on that, but I think it's something that would be interesting to hear people talk about, and maybe their experiences with that as well. So some of these new measures, this is a good example. I wish this idea to be impressed on all your minds, for there has long been an idea prevalent that promoting religion has something very peculiar in it, not to be judged of by the ordinary rules of cause and effect. In short, that there is no connecting of the means with the result, and no tendency in the means to produce the effect. No doctrine is more dangerous than this to the prosperity of the church, and nothing more absurd. And as a kind of practical example of some of these new measures, which included kind of hosting late night prayer services, hosting extended hours worth of preaching, having multiple days of services. These are things that are referred to by new measures, which, like I said before, when we think about revival, those are often a lot of things we think of as accompanying revival. Another thing that accompanied that was the anxious bench, which was something that Finney would, in the tents that he was preaching in or in churches, it was literally a bench that would be up in the front of the congregation, and he would invite anyone who, as they were coming into that service, felt like there was some sort of troubling effect in their soul, or they were questioning, or they were wrestling with something, or they were wrestling with God, or they just needed to kind of have a focused time in that service. And they would literally go up to the front, and they would sit on this anxious bench, and that is where they would sit during service. Finney was known for preaching directly at people. He might call someone by name. That was a kind of taboo no-no in a lot of preaching prior to this time. You don't call someone out by name in the service. But Finney did that a lot. Altar calls similarly.
That has again become a taboo.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It has, yeah. But for a long time, it was very common to kind of call out, oh yes, you John, or
positive that God loves you, Joel.
Yeah, exactly. But the altar call is another one of these new measures that hadn't really existed in a lot of Protestantism prior to really kind of anywhere prior to this time. It becomes much more common. The phrase "walk the sawdust" became a common phrase during this time because in tent camps, or in the big tents where they would have revivals, when you put a tent up for too long, the grass dies, things get muddy, and so they would put down sawdust, one, to deaden the sound, but also to keep people from getting super muddy. And so if you were going to walk the sawdust, you would be going towards the altar to give your life to God or to make some sort of confession. So the altar call becomes a very prominent part of the American religious experience during this time. In contrast to Finney, you have someone like Beecher here, who is not quite a fan of some of these new measures. Indeed, from the principles contained in Mr. Finney's sermon, he's referring to an earlier sermon referencing some of these measures. And from what I know concerning revivals which have taken place under his immediate auspices, I'm sure that the new measures, as they are justly called, though not unattended with some good, do nevertheless introduce into revivals another spirit, of whose nature and in general influence, those who countenance these measures seem not to be aware. It is a spirit of fanaticism, of spiritual pride, censoriousness, and insubordination to the order of the gospel, which, if not met by the timely and decided disapprobation of ministers and churches, threatens to become one of the greatest evils which is likely to befall the cause of Christ. So on both sides, you hear Calvinism is the greatest clog on Christianity in the world, and you hear this could be one of the greatest evils which is likely to befall the cause of Christ. A little contentious. People have strong opinions about what's going on.
Hot takes.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very well written hot takes. These aren't. They're not just ripping off tweets. They're stewing over these things for a long time. Yeah. They're, again, if you want to read any of these, they're fun to read. So I'm happy to send over. Finney responds to this, a few years later. In his book, revivals can be put down by the continued opposition of the old school. He's referring here to what we just read, combined with a bad spirit in the new school. If those who do nothing to promote revivals continue their opposition, and if those who are laboring to promote them allow themselves to get impatient and get into a bad spirit, the revival will cease. When the old school write letters in the newspapers against revivals or revival men, and the new school write letters back again against them in angry and contentious, bitter spirit, and get into a jangling controversy, revivals will cease. Let them keep about their work, and not talk about the opposition, nor preach, nor print about it. If others choose to publish their slang and stuff, let the Lord's servants keep to their work, and all the writing and slander will not stop the revival, while those who are engaged in it mind their business and keep to their work. Now, in some ways, this is optimistic, because, like we said before, Finney is also engaged in some of this letter writing and other things. But in some ways, you see that both of these sides are recognizing they don't want to necessarily be in this conflict, but they kind of are, and they have convictions, and it's messy. And I like diving into a little bit of that messiness. Speaking of messiness at the time, slavery over the course of the 1800s becomes essentially the topic of contention within churches in America. A prominent historian of this period, Mark Knoll, talks about the early 1800s being the time of a Bible civilization, when interdenominationally, Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, whoever, are essentially saying we can have a society that is devoid of these denominational boundaries because we just believe in the Bible. We just believe the Bible and that's that. And as the 1800s come along, Mark Knoll argues that this does not work long term because of the issue of slavery. Because about half of the Christians in the country believed that slavery was a sin, and about half of them believed it was not a sin. And they were both starting from the Bible, and that was their authority. And so it becomes a very contentious issue. And so we're going to see a little bit of that issue here with these three figures. On the far left here, anybody know who that is? Frederick Douglass. Guy in the middle here? Or, not guy. Lady in the middle. Sarah Grimke. That would be another good guess, Beecher Stowe. Sarah Grimke, she was born in the South, became a prominent abolitionist. We'll read a little bit of her stuff in a bit.
Related
James
to
Thornwood.
Is she related to Francis?
Yes, yeah, they're sisters.
How did you know that?
Well, Francis is a man.
Friend of mine.
Oh yeah, Frances is the man, but then she also had another sister.
Wait, she
You all didn't know you're that old.
No. That's FRA and CES, right?
Uh-huh. CIS.
CIS? Okay, I don't know.
Charlotte, Fort and Grimke. The black people.
Okay. Other figures that
The person on
probably
the right is James Thornwell.
correct. Yes. Good. Steve beat you to it. Good. Yes.
I did
So
not know who that
James
was.
Henley Thornwell, and he is most famous, notorious for being kind of the prominent theologian who defended slavery in the South. He's a Presbyterian minister in the South, and we'll read a little bit of what he wrote during this period as well. So this becomes, again, kind of the dividing issue. The appendix to Douglas's narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass is required reading of all of you at this point. If you've not read it, highly recommend. But we'll read a bit here. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity. Note, this is 45 years after Cambridge revival, essentially after the Second Great Awakening has kind of reached its full height. Revivals of religion and revivals in the slave trade go hand in hand together. The slave prison and the church stand near each other. The clanking of fetters and the rattling of chains in the prison and the pious psalm and solemn prayer in the church may be heard at the same time. The dealers in the bodies and souls of men erect their stand in the presence of the pulpit, and they mutually help each other. The dealer gives his blood-stained gold to support the pulpit, and the pulpit in his turn recovers his infernal business with the garb of Christianity. So that's 1846. We're less than 20 years out from the Civil War. James Henley Thornwell, writing kind of one of his famous sermons, he's writing to Southern pastors and Southern men here. We would say unto you and our brethren of the South, go in your present undertaking, and though our common enemies may continue to revile, you will be consolidating the elements of your social fabric so firmly and compactly that it shall defy the storms of fanaticism, while the spectacle you will exhibit of union, sympathy, and confidence among the different orders of the community will be a standing refutation of all their accusations against us. Go on in this noble enterprise until every slave in our borders shall know of Jesus and the resurrection, and the blessing of God will attend you. And turn back the tide of indignation which the public opinion of the world is endeavoring to roll upon you. Go on in this career and afford another illustration of what all experience has demonstrated, that Christianity is the cheap defense of every institution which contributes to the progress of man. So this argument that he lays out here, that Christianity allows these slaveholders to be nice to their slaves in order to uphold the institution that leads to the progress of man, leads to economic progress.
When he says Christianity is the cheap defense, is he saying that it's the free public good?
Correct. Yes, he's saying it's
Okay.
essentially a public good that rather than the costly defense of having to muster an army or other things, you can just use Christianity, and that will quell all of the issues and the fighting over slavery. That will keep the slaves quiet, it will keep them docile, it can keep them down so long as we give them Christianity to be able to defend them. And this becomes kind of one of the leading ways that the South would defend slavery, basing it in their understanding of the Bible. So again, this becomes a significant issue. And then Sarah Grimke, in an epistle to the clergy of the Southern states, writes, "A solemn sense of the duty which I owe as a Southerner to every class of the community of which I was once part, likewise impels me to address you, especially who are filling the important and responsible station of ministers of Jehovah, expounders of the lively oracles of God. My mind has been deeply impressed with the belief that there is in America a degree of light, knowledge, and intelligence which leaves us without excuse before God for upholding the system of slavery. And this is the sin which the church is fostering. In her bosom, this is the leprosy over which she is casting the mantle of charity to hide, if possible, the putrefying sores. This is the monster around which she is twining her maternal arms, and before which she is placing her anointed shield of inscribed holiness to the Lord. O ye ministers of him who so loved the slave that he gave his precious blood to redeem him from sin, can ye any longer, with your eyes fixed upon the cross of Christ, plant your foot on his injured representative, and sanction and sanctify this heartbreaking, this soul-destroying system?" So that's Sarah Grimke, expressing a lot of what the Northern abolitionists, so affected by a lot of the Great Awakening, a lot of this new talk of free salvation unto all, are channeling into a great social movement of abolition.
The last sentence is powerful.
Extremely powerful. And so we get into some of the long-term impacts of. Good job, Ian. In addition to what we. Oh, you're good, John. Oh, his finger is in there. Yikes.
That's sweet.
Oh, hold your breath, buddy.
Round 3.
Bye, Jan. So, in,
Pause. Yeah, it was. They had it before too. You had a big cry.
Should I wait?
And there was a big crowd.
So, in addition to, like we said earlier, a lot of the ways that even we, 150, 200 years later, think about revival are very much downstream from this. The tents, the altar calls, the late night prayer services, etc. As much as those things are downstream from this, there are also a lot of other long-term impacts of the Second Great Awakening. The first being a dramatic rise in church-going. Thinking of church-going or church membership, just generally kind of religious adherence. Now, as an economist, I like to measure things and put numbers on things. Measuring religion, measuring these things is very hard. It's hard to put numbers on some of this stuff. Like what counts as a churchgoer? Someone who goes every 2 weeks, is there every Sunday, etc. Organizations like Pew, their entire job is to do kinds of things like this. But nonetheless, people have tried. And I think one of the best attempts is a book called The Church in America by Finke and Stark, who are two sociologists of religion. And they put together a kind of composite measure of religiosity, basing things off of the number of pews in buildings, historic church rolls, things like that. And they put together a kind of long-term trend of religious adherence in the United States. And one of the things that I think is important to note from this is this far left bar here, under 20%, is 1776. So a lot of people think of 1776 as being when America was the most Christian. And then it kind of, declined or whatever, and we've been up and down. But across the 1800s and really up through the 1950s or 60s, that has actually been a kind of upward climb of religious adherence. Can you see the numbers there?
Yeah, I was just so it's 70 at the top, and then like 40 is the middle.
62, 59, 56, 53, 51, 45, 35, 37, 34, 17.
Yeah.
It's like an evil grin.
Wow.
I was mostly trying to figure out the range on the left.
Oh, on the
But I
left.
see.
Oh, yeah, up to 70% there. Yeah, and so
Oh.
it kind of peaks.
I'm glad you can read every number.
Sorry, 70, 62, 1980 there at the end. I would kind of contend with that last number. I think American church going kind of peaked in the 60s, maybe even late 50s. But that's for another day. But nonetheless, I think a lot of historians generally agree with this trend that across the 1800s and into the 1900s, the amount that Americans were involved in church, were involved in religious activities, dramatically grew over time. So this is one prominent effect of the Second Great
Sorry,
Awakening.
what's the last year on the right?
In 1980.
80.
1980. Yeah. Yeah. I disagree with that one. I think 52 is probably peak, but whatever. It's close enough. Other developments, new denominations and theological developments. So, like I said before, the African Methodist Episcopal Church is a representative of a lot of the African American denominations that were formed by slaves and also free blacks in the North that became prominent across this time. Seventh-day Adventists were another group that actually spawned off of a millenarian movement who thought, their leader thought, this is going to be the day that the Lord returns. He didn't, so they founded a denomination instead and continue on to this day.
Still waiting.
Which I think because they meet on Saturdays, a lot of people think that they're like very different from the way that a lot of Protestants believe. But aside from meeting on Saturdays, they're pretty smack dab in the middle of what you would consider like evangelical Protestantism. Their belief-wise, they're pretty well in the middle.
They live long.
They do live very long. exercise is
Sabbath.
important for them. Yeah. And Sabbath. Yeah.
Vegetarianism.
Vegetarianism, lots of things, lots of things. Some people have watched Blue Zones. Anyway, it's a good show. The Disciples of Christ are another group that, especially coming out of that New England phase of the Great Awakening, a lot of Congregationalist churches there. The Disciples of Christ come out of that. Up in that burned over district in the 1920s, a young man named Joseph Smith has a vision, finds some golden plates, etc. Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is born, known as Mormonism. This is another movement that's very representative of the time. If you read the Book of Mormon, the extreme patriotism, the kind of extreme focus on the United States being a kind of instrument of God, it's representing a lot of the dynamics that are happening during this Second Great Awakening period. A couple of new theological emphases as well. Like I said before, a kind of dramatic decline in traditional Calvinism is happening. Millenarianism becomes really big at this time. And kind of alongside that, the idea of the rapture and dispensationalism, led by a couple of British theologians, namely C.I. Scofield, becomes a very, very prominent movement within the United States.
Can you define just a little bit more about millenarianism?
Millenarianism.
Because is that mostly the idea you can predict the future? Is that more?
Kind of. It's more generally used just to capture the idea that there's a lot of energy and fervor towards expecting the imminent return of Christ. So there have been millenarian movements long before this time, throughout church history. You can pick a century, and I can find you a couple of millenarian movements that are happening during that time. People who thought Jesus is definitely coming back now. During like the Black Death period, for example, a lot of people were like, obviously Jesus is coming back soon. During the Reformation period, obviously Jesus is coming back. During World War II, obviously Jesus is coming back. You get the idea. But that it kind of comes in waves over time, and this historians view as a time when this is really happening a lot. Yeah. So, any questions on any of that? Okay. In addition to some of these more kind of traditionally theological forms, we had some social reforms. Does anyone know what this
France
house
Wood
is?
Museum. I lived right next to it in college.
France, yes. So,
Not make that one.
if anyone wants to go and see a piece of the Second Great Awakening, you can essentially just walk up to Evanston. Period. So Evanston was founded by Methodists. Northwestern was a Methodist college, founded out of this. And Frances Willard, who was the leader of the Women's Christian Temperance Movement, which is a anti-alcohol, kind of pro-temperance movement, kind of the prominent one in the United States. She lived up in Evanston. And so this is an example of what historians talk about, a transition from some of the kind of camp-meeting religious fervor that's happening, and especially as the Methodists in particular begin to be less disaggregated across the United States, and they start to form some institutions. Baptists do this a little bit, but to a lesser degree. They start forming institutions, and they start thinking about what are some of the longer-term impacts that we can have on our society, and they start doing some of these movements, like temperance, anti-smoking, women's suffrage, and then, like we said before, abolition being kind of the preeminent one of the period. Yeah?
I just want to throw this out there because I read a way too long book about prohibition a few years ago. Because I always thought that they were like anti-alcohol, but really they were anti the trade of liquor because they saw, first of all, male abuse within homes.
Yep.
Many alcoholic men who would abuse their wives and children. And then they saw basically like the corporate greed underlying the entire system of it. So a lot of them were actually, like temperance was a way to abstain, to kind of stick it to the broader power structure of it. But it was more like anti-exploiting poor people who were very drunk, and also kind of anti-abuse. So I just really appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be like throwing your phone in the lake because you don't like the mineral mines of addiction. Sounds good. Okay. So that is kind of all of the content that I've got. I know we're 8:15. I have to wrap up soon. But I have a couple of questions. We'll just start with first. What do you find most surprising about Second Great Awakening? What stands out to you? Something that you didn't know, or
the numbers are pretty crazy to me. Like 20 to 30,000 in a town population density, and the fact that they're just like in the sticks, 20 to 30,000 people.
Yeah, look up Cane Ridge. It's in the middle of nowhere.
Like I'm wondering how much canvassing looked like to make sure that many people knew where it was going to be.
Well, community was also closer at that time. They didn't have a lot of distractions. There's no internet, there's no TV, so you know.
Lights.
True.
It's true.
Yeah, no electric lights either. That's a really good point. Yeah, these are fire, candle, moonlight. That's all they've got.
It's much brighter when there's no other lights.
Yeah.
Female preachers. I'm pretty sure they're open to female preachers.
Yeah. And they is generous. I think some parts very, very much embrace this. And you saw this also with the First Great Awakening, that there were some female preachers. And usually it would be fairly controversial. It's really not until the 20th century where it becomes a little bit more kind of, when this pops up, it's not like people are like, whoa, what's going on? But definitely at this time, people are a little taken aback, and depending on the denomination. Yeah, like Jarena Lee that we had there, she definitely met with opposition at the beginning of the period as she went to preach. So,
Is this when the concept of rapture comes about, or was it before?
It kind of depends. I'm fairly convinced that the idea of a kind of literal pre-tribulation rapture, that this is kind of the first time that you see that in church history. I think Schofield is a kind of innovator in that way, but it's you have to twist texts a lot throughout the rest of church history to find a clear example of someone who would agree with that prior to him.
I think I was surprised at the opposition to it. I guess when I think about awakening, it's like, oh, like every Christian should be excited that people are turning to Jesus. But then that there was this like, well, you're not doing it the right way, or it's chaotic, or like just that they're coming to be an opposition. They're coming from two sides to something.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I was struck by like the poor itinerant preachers on horseback. Obviously you have the big names, but then at a meeting where you have like 5 sermons going on simultaneously for days at a time, you have probably some pretty average shows that, like you said, are not exactly building mansions off of this sort of thing. Just kind of a fun thought.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, a lot of average Joes stepping up, saying, "Okay, the Lord has given me a word, and I'm going to preach it." Absolutely. Yeah. So to what extent?
I was actually just Finney's argument for his methods. I've forgotten that it's in my mind, it's not a terrible argument. You know what I mean?
The idea that you shouldn't ignore cause and effect when it comes to these things.
Right, and so it's like, well, I disagree with him, but I was like, wait a second, appreciate. There's a reason why he is revered in some circles, and why he has so many generations.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I was thinking about space too. While you're right with the running stuff in a fields where obviously at church we met in a park. We could have in theory run, but I feel much more enclosed physically in any of my worship spaces where just like the idea of there's an image of just kind of roaming in the camp meetings that I'm like, that feels very foreign.
Definitely.
They lost me.
A kind of open field where like you could just walk 1,000 miles that direction and not hit anyone.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's dark.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Very, very different. How does this Second Great Awakening, kind of what we've heard, fit or not with our working definition of the Bible, which we can go back to the beginning here. Was where were we?
A deepening of religious.
A pronounced deepening of religious feeling and expression. To what extent does what we talked about kind of fit with that definition?
Well, I mean, if that's our working definition, then the numbers show what the numbers show, and the stories tell what the stories tell.
Yeah.
If it's an experience or a feeling that people are stating, that it definitely would fit into our working definition of revival.
Is there anything we should change about the definition? Anything that needs added to it or tweaked as a result?
I feel like the expectation of revival really depends on like which culture it is. Like in the Philippines, like yeah, you'll probably see a lot more people who's like, their definition of revival is like, it's a little bit more expressive than in America. Whereas like right now, I think like in America, like revivals hinge more on like intellectualism. So like how does it make sense to people logically? You're probably not going to see people here like doing a lot of jerking unless you're like in Pentecostal circles.
Yeah.
But like it doesn't mean that it's not revival. It's just happening in a different cultural context.
I think that maybe if I was to add something to our working definition, it would have to be a God-initiated feeling or experience.
I like that. Yeah.
And then maybe you would have some sub-markers, and that kind of gets back to like Frederick Douglass's quote. I mean, all these revivals have happened, yet at the same time, people are still comfortable with ignoring the image of God in people. And so, I mean, there's a danger, of course, to say how quickly God has to work in a particular person to make someone who is formerly a racist that hated people of the former race all of a sudden to embrace them. That's very difficult. That person could actually be undergoing revival, and we may not be able to see it. At the same time, there are changes. And I do think there are changes that have happened. It's just hard to say, we didn't really get into it. How much was abolition related to these revival movements or not? And then how much, therefore, was the Civil War related to that or not? So those are bigger questions too.
Absolutely.
But I think that at least you have to say it has to be a God initiated, and then people have been working out what are the marks of what God has actually initiated. And some people would say prayer, worship, love for the church, change in society, things like that.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And with the change in society is there, it's just a matter of whether that's what we're supposed to be looking for.
Yeah. Any other things that you think are missing from the definition we should add? We'll also talk about this tomorrow, so you can mull it over. Yeah. Thinking about the Second Great Awakening, would you consider yourself more of an old light or new light? Not just your general temperament, but just kind of. Obviously, we've given a very, very quick 30,000-foot overview, a whole bunch of nuance and everything that we can't get into now. If you want a stack of books, let me know. But just what's vibe check here? What's an old light, new light?
In today's world?
No, about Second Great Awakening.
Oh, new light because I'm black.
There you go.
I feel open to it. I think there's like I appreciate the graph of deepening religiosity, but I was also like I feel very struck by the story of the doctor, and it seems like he has very sincere conversion to Christ. But I'd love to have followed up with him in like 15 years.
Yeah.
And we don't have that. So it's like I feel very open to it. It's like it seems like God was really working.
Yeah, and we don't have it in this presentation, and maybe not for that guy in particular, but one of the amazing things about 1700s on is the English people historically were very very excited about writing things, particularly journals, and so the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening are some of the time periods where we have the most amount of writing from lay people, not just pastors talking about them, but actual journals of people that they thought no one would ever read, which are really fun to read and very exciting to get into kind of the mentality of what's going on with some of these people and their experiences. So if that's of interest to you, also happy to send along some of that.
I would also consider myself a new light. I just realized, in what part of it, I really give you credit, Joel, because at Trinity, and I had a great history of Christianity in the United States professor, but I would say everything I read was very favorable towards the First Great Awakening and very antagonistic towards the Second Great Awakening. Almost to the point where the first was the real thing, people are getting theologically serious, they're reading their Bible, this other thing, Phoenix is causing all this ruckus. That wasn't...
Yeah, that is a very typical telling of history, absolutely. Yeah.
So, and again, it wasn't the way he told it, but a lot of the sources I was reading, that's how they, they're writing from like 1888, they're like, this whole thing, this last 60 or 70 years was crazy, but that was the real thing that happened in the 1700s.
Yeah.
And I was, as you presented it, I was like, okay, You know, you can see the hand of God in it,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's messy.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I tend to be far less skeptical of what we call awakenings in history than I am things that would be given the name awakening in today's time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I tend to be more new light looking back than I am in my own
Yeah.
present life.
That makes a lot of sense.
I think we're talking about, I can't remember your total time ranges, but like decades and decades of history.
Yeah, this is
Where-
40-ish years, yeah.
The things we're kind of asked to evaluate in the moment are,
Yeah.
it's just so much more discreet.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Cane Ridge, you couldn't, getting 10 years historical distance on Cane Ridge would put us, in the 2030s, and that's, it takes a while to have some historical distance to view these things.
Yeah.
I think that's a good point. Yeah. Final question. What can we learn from the Second Great Awakening about determining whether a revival is real? This kind of goes along with that. Is there anything we can learn about that?
Honestly, it's really
Unless
like
you're-
time distance.
Mhm.
Like you can't really like tell. Like when. I mean, it's like there are signs when it's actually happening, but the results of a revival, I feel like you're going to see it over time. I've been to a lot of revivals, when I was like younger, and like the people who attend a revival like stayed true to the faith or stayed the course. A lot of them did, but like they were probably the most performative people I've seen like during that revival. So, but like as time went on, I'm like, oh, well, they kind of like stayed the course. So was there actually like a revival for them at that time? There's probably revival for some people. So I feel like not really able to like determine that at the time the revival is happening.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Absolutely. Steve, you're going to say that?
I'm going to say something about Ralph first, and then I'll say what I was going to say. Ralph said something. He went to a revival.
Mm-hmm.
Old light kicked in. A revival comes to you. Is how I think about that. And unless you bend forward and backward and your head touches the ground, the revival isn't real. That was the second.
Yes. Oh, man.
That's a great point.
We better get praying. we better get praying.
Well,
And stretching.
I know you're going to talk about it tomorrow, but I just never really heard that much about those kinds of events prior to Azusa Street.
Mm-hmm.
And that was that's interesting to think about. I had to chew on that, but I don't know. I mean, how would you answer that, Joel? I mean, like what can we learn about? Do we have? Because you didn't really say here's the categories. Did this fit or not? So what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I somewhat, give the historian answer of like what Ralph was saying. It's hard until you have some historical distance to be able to look at it well. I do think having a kind of heuristic up front of assuming that the Holy Spirit is working, regardless of the time period, regardless of kind of what's going on, that like God is working, and I like being able to bring that to kind of a present time of like, maybe the Holy Spirit is working here. Like He's always working, obviously. Maybe this is a revival. But I guess we gotta wait 10 years. I don't know. Yeah.
I know you put up the church attendance. Or the church.
Yeah, church adherence, churchgoers. It's kind of a composite measure, but yeah.
2025 was an exceptional year for the number of Bibles sold. In September, had a surge of over 1 million Bibles were sold.
Wow.
In September, higher than the other ones. But there was 25 million all year.
Wow.
And I guess that's significantly greater than years past. So does that, I don't know. It's just another measurement, like churchgoers. You were saying that they might be churchgoers, but they might just be there for
once a month, twice a month.
Something.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to measure this. But the purchase of Bibles would be a fun way to measure. Yeah.
Also, when I think of revival, it's a very personal thing. And this time, this time in our lives, it's very something we struggle with and pray about and all of that.
Yeah.
And so, and I did really. It was interesting when you had the different opposite opposite point of view, and that makes me think that how important that these people who were moving along in this era, it was really important to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you don't write several books about a movement of God without it having a very important personal stake.
Really working it out.
Yeah,
you know.
Absolutely. Yeah, and maybe to go back to Jeremiah's question to me a little bit, one of the kind of guiding, a helpful resource in answering that fourth question for me has been the later response that Jonathan Edwards then wrote in defense of the original Great Awakening, where he wrote about the religious affections and trying to, it's kind of his attempt to sift through what are the real signs of conversion and revival, and what are those that are not real signs. And I think, I don't remember the exact marks off the top of my head, but he tries to go through Scripture and provide like a helpful guide to thinking about that. So that has been a helpful resource for me for sure. So, yeah.
Would you say that revival brings about real cultural change? Right, like we see it here with things like abolition and whatnot. Is that a theme throughout? Or is
like
that
does it or must it?
Right. Is it specific to this one that we see cultural change?
No, definitely not. And I think we'll see that tomorrow as we look at our kind of two other case studies. That definitely societal changes do come out of these things.
But there is got to be some like a critical threshold where enough people corporately experience it.
Correct.
If me and Ralph just get a little more serious about Jesus, that's not a revival. But if all of our church, our church might be able to say, but then if all the churches in Riders Park grow by 150% in the next 6 months, then maybe Riders Park is seeing a revival.
So we're back to the numbers game, right?
Yeah.
But it's absolutely true. It's absolutely true because if you can get a certain enough, I'm sorry, I think I'm coming down with a cold. My brain is not working anymore. But if a large enough percentage, it doesn't even have to be maybe a majority, right? But if a large enough percentage is going to agree on something and be active in something, that alone would be a shift.
Absolutely.
I think though it maybe is more than just like total numbers. It feels like there has to be something about like people getting, kind of saying corporate, getting together. Like I think about the Billy Graham big tents, all these big tents, all Azusa Street. Like there's something happening with people getting really excited together in a group.
Yeah, no, there's certainly a social aspect.
Yeah.
Like it just, at least from a historical perspective, this is not a judgment on whether God is working in it, because He's working in both of these. But like we wouldn't call like a two-person gathering necessarily a revival if we then didn't see other things accompanying that two-person. It's like just from a historical perspective, we're not going to look at that and say that's a revival.
One more thought, then I'm going to let Joel wind it down however you want, so you can have some pray or whatever. But we do have to be back here by 9 tomorrow.
We do.
So we'll have a little bit of breakfast and then get started. We got some stuff, pastries, coffee. Don't come as hungry as you did tonight. And also take some food home tonight as well. By the way, but Joel, you can wind it down.
Okay, great. Would someone like to close us out in prayer? Actually, before that, tomorrow I'm going to print out a couple of short readings. So I'm going to talk a little less tomorrow, which will be nice for all of you. And you will talk a little more. We're going to do a couple of short readings. Don't worry, they won't be too long. A little bit more open discussion. But we'll look at 2 case studies. Like I said, the Franciscan reforms of the 12 into 1300s, which I'm hoping, maybe complicates a little bit more of our understanding of what's going on here. It stretches us to think a little more about that. And then Azusa Street as well,
So there were revivals before 1517?
That's a good question. Exactly.
I was wondering what Bible people were reading.
The what?
1700. What Bible they were
The Geneva Bible is kind of the typical translation, at least in New England. Yeah, so that would have been the one that at least the early settlers in the 1600s using. Then it becomes the King James version, and that's the version. So by the time this period comes along, it's KJV all the way. Yeah. Which is great because you get unicorns. Yeah, there are unicorns in the KJV. It's just how they translate it. But yeah, would someone like to close us in prayer and pray for some revival?
I can.
Please do.
Jesus, thank you that we get to come together and be bolstered. Thank you that that in the gathering of your church, you sanctify us and that you bring us to a place of being able to be revived. Lord, right now we ask that you would start, and maybe you already have, God, start revival in America, in the world, God. And Lord, we ask that you would let Chicago play a critical role in that. Lord, let us at Agape Chicago be part of what you're doing in Chicago, and let that be part of what you're doing in the world. Lord, let us be open, let us be ready, let us be willing. God, let us bring whatever we may have to you and to each other. And God, let it be a time of purification here, so that your truth, your love, your grace can go out to the rest of the world. We thank you and praise you for who you are. Amen.
All right. How's everybody doing?
Good.
Ready for round two?
Yeah.
Okay. Sweet. Yeah. Someone want to open us up in prayer before we get started?
God, thank you for this day and for wonderful people in your body and for an opportunity to gather together on Saturday morning with sunshine. And pray that we would have fun, getting to use our brains in new ways, and you would help us to see you more clearly through all of this and to follow you more faithfully as a result of it. In your name, amen.
Amen. All right. So I think Kisney's the only one who wasn't here yesterday. To give you a brief overview, yesterday we kind of did some groundwork of kind of what is revival in church, in history, and what's the term mean, what are features of it, and then we talked about the Second Great Awakening, particularly in the United States, and kind of what that was, different features. And one of the key things we've been thinking about is the idea of old lights versus new lights. Those who are maybe a little more optimistic about what's going on in a revival, those who are maybe a little more hesitant to embrace the revival. And that throughout history, at each revival, you see a kind of combination of those two different groups, figuring out, is this a real revival, is this not? And there's always kind of a tension there to think about. So today we're going to go into two different case studies. The first being the Franciscan reforms of the 13th century, and then second we're going to talk about Azusa Street and the birth of Pentecostalism. And we're going to use these are probably a little bit out of our wheelhouse for a lot of us in this room of thinking about revival, and maybe something that is a little bit new to you. For myself, these are not particular. The Great Awakenings and stuff like that, I've done a lot more kind of schoolwork study on those. These are a little bit newer to me, so there's going to be a little less content from me, a little bit more discussion, and we're going to do a couple of readings together. I've got some packets that I'll pass out, and we'll spend a little bit of time doing that. And yeah, think about what does it look like to think of revival, to conceive of revival outside of context that we might normally think of, and to what extent does that shape our own understanding of revival, and yeah, give us a better sense of the ways that God works in the world. So, without further ado, we're going to look at the 13th century Franciscan movement. This is a famous painting of St. Francis feeding, but also maybe preaching to the birds. Yeah, so that would be St. Francis. So, St. Francis, my guess is everyone here has heard of St. Francis. He's probably one of the most famous of the medieval Christians, probably one of the most famous Roman Catholic saints. Widely recognized, just very, very prominent guy, but a lot of people don't really know much about his background or what he did to become so famous. So to give some background, he was born in 1181 or 82 in Assisi, Italy, which you can see in this map here is kind of right in the middle of Italy, kind of up in the mountains. It'd be maybe a couple hours drive from Rome. Small family, or small town there, to a very wealthy merchant family. His dad was a merchant. This was a time, like we talked about yesterday, revivals and movements of God often happen in times where there's a lot of change happening in the world. This is a time when the rise of the Medici family in Italy is starting to come about. You're starting to see commerce and finance become much more important in this period. A lot of trade is happening, and Francis's family is a beneficiary of this. They're very wealthy. So he grows up as kind of a rich kid, kind of can do whatever he wants. And one of the things that you would go and do at this time was go and join the military. So Italy at this time is not a unified nation. It's a lot of very small kingdoms. At one point, his kingdom's kind of taken over by a neighboring kingdom. His family are kind of prisoners of war for a little bit. But then he, later in life, probably around his 20s or so, decides, I'm going to go and join the military. That's what all the cool kids do. While he's on his way there, he, in his retelling, receives a call from God that, no, this is not the life I have for you. You're not going to go and be a soldier. And so he goes back to Assisi. And while he's in Assisi, there's a couple of different tellings of exactly what happened, different conversion stories in his life. But at some point in this, he is praying in a small church where, which I'll show a picture in the next slide. And he's praying in a small church, and he receives a call from God that says, Francis, go and repair my church, which as you see is falling down. And Francis kind of interprets this at a very literal level, and so he starts going around and collecting stones to rebuild some of the chapels and churches that had been falling down around the town. This was a time when, from his perception, like people were neglecting going to church, people were neglecting taking care of the house of God. I'm going to go do this. Simultaneously, he interprets it at a much deeper spiritual level to say, this is a call for me to go and live what it means to be a Christian in this time and show people, yeah, we need to repair God's house at a spiritual level as well. So as he's kind of going around carrying stones, helping people, encouraging people to help repair the churches, his father gets a little upset. He says, Francis, you are getting a little crazy here, a little bit too spiritually fanatical for me. This is not the life that I had planned for you. So he goes to the local bishop. And the local bishop tries to get Francis to say, hey, like you're gonna have to make a choice here. Like, are you gonna do what your family said? Are you gonna follow in the line of being a merchant like your dad? Well, you got to make a choice here. And so, in public, in front of everyone in the town square, the legend has it that Francis disrobed entirely, took all of his clothes off, set them at the feet of his father, and said, I hereby announce all of the wealth of the family, and I'm committing my life to poverty. So from that point forward, he committed himself to not use any of his family's money. He said, this is a trap, this is going to lead me into sin, I'm not going to take any of this money, and to do the work that I need to do for the church, I cannot accept that. So here is when he really commits his life to a life of poverty. There's also another story, the timelines are not exact on all of this, but he tells of a time when he's working on kind of doing this repair work for churches, and he's outside of the city walls where there's a leper. And at this time, lepers, as in the New Testament time period, would have been shunned from society because there were not cures. It's very contagious for different skin diseases and whatnot. And he, keeping in mind what Jesus did, goes and says, I think I need to touch this leper. I need to go and care for this person. And so he goes and he touches the leper. And a lot of biographers talk about this being a key turning point in his life, where not only is he going to be committed to rebuilding the church, but he's going to be committed to caring for the poor as kind of his primary mode of doing that repair work. And so now after he renounces his father's wealth, he sets out, he says, all right, I'm committed to a life of poverty. I want to go and share the gospel with people and do so in a life of poverty. So a couple of pictures here. This is actually still standing, the chapel where St. Francis reportedly was praying when he received this call from God. It's in a small monastery in Assisi, so you can go there. I unfortunately have not been there, but would love to go at some point. So you can visit that. And these are two verses that would have been in Francis's mind as he was committing his life to poverty. Jesus looking at the rich young ruler and saying, one thing you lack, go and sell everything you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. And blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So these are, if you had to sum up what is driving Francis in his call to follow the Lord in the life of poverty, this would pretty well sum it up. This is the main town square where Francis reportedly renounced the wealth of his family. Again, you can go there to this day. It obviously didn't look quite like this back in the day, but it's pretty well preserved as what it was like at the time. We also have a recorded prayer that Francis, in addition to being an itinerant preacher, in addition to caring for the poor, in addition to all these other things, is a really well-known poet. So he did a lot of writing. We actually sing some of his hymns to this day. All Creatures of Our God and King, which we sing at church, is based off of a poem that St. Francis himself wrote. This is a poem that he wrote, maybe was the prayer that he was praying when he was in this chapel and received his call, maybe not. But I thought it was beautiful and wanted to include it. Most high, glorious God, enlighten the darkness of my heart, and give me, Lord, a correct faith, a certain hope, a perfect charity, sense and knowledge, so that I might carry out your holy and true command. So, after Francis receives his call, after he commits himself to a life of poverty, it's still not exactly sure what this is going to look like. But, as one can imagine, you see someone who's got this fervor, this excitement to follow the Lord and follow him. Francis starts to get a band of followers. He starts to get some people who are like, okay, I like this Francis guy. I'm going to hang out with him, and we're going to go around and we're going to do the Lord's work together. And so at this time, Francis decides, okay, we're going to try to found an order. We're going to try to found something officially sanctioned by the Catholic Church, so that we can then carry this out with the blessing of the institutional church behind us. So like I said, Francis quickly gained some followers. They committed themselves to humility, simplicity, poverty, and prayer. Were kind of some of the main things that they're focused on. And we'll get into a couple of the other features later. And so very shortly after Francis receives his call and starts to gain some followers, he gets permission from Pope Innocent III, which this is a portrayal of Pope Innocent over there, to form a religious order with the sanction of the Catholic Church. So, for those who aren't familiar with what a religious order is in the Catholic Church throughout the medieval period and up through the present, a religious order is a group of people who say we are going to commit our lives to a particular set of vows, a particular way of living our Christian life that we're doing in a community together. We're holding each other accountable to this particular way of doing things. So at this time, Franciscans are formed. You might have heard of the Dominicans, might have heard of the Jesuits, might have heard of the Benedictines. There's a variety of different orders within the church that people would commit themselves to a particular way of doing life together as Christians. In no way does this mean that they're saying everyone must live like we are living. In fact, we'll get into this a little bit of why the Franciscans are somewhat unique in this time period. But it's a way of saying we feel called by the Lord to live a certain way, and we want to be held accountable to that by joining in a community and focusing on these things together. So they get permission from Pope Innocent to form a religious order. The order then grew extremely quickly. So by about 10 years after the founding of the order, they had 5,000 plus members, which in the 1200s, that's moving pretty quick. Things were not moving like the speed of the internet today. This is a lot of word of mouth. This is just city to city. They're saying, wow, like whatever started in Assisi, we're gonna jump on board with this. We're gonna get behind what's going on. We like these emphases. And so there were actually then 3 orders that were founded. So the Friars Minor is when you think of a Franciscan monk, a male, that is this first order. So these are men who commit themselves to a life of poverty. We'll read the rule that they follow. That is the original rule from 1223 that's still the one in use today. But that would be the male order. The second one is the poor ladies, or the Clares, because Clare of Assisi, around 1209, became very, very good friends with St. Francis. She similarly committed her life to a life of poverty, wanted to join in on this movement. And so, as a part of the kind of official order that the Friars Minor was able to put together, the poor ladies were also then approved by the Roman Catholic Church and started their own order as well, committed to very similar things. And so these would be the Franciscan nuns. These would be the only women in that order. And then third, and something that is very unique about the Franciscans, and which is why I chose this movement as something of, to get us to think about what does it mean to think about this in terms of revival, is that there are the Brothers and Sisters of Penance, which is the lay order of the Franciscan movement. So this includes any lay person who wants to commit themselves to some of the ideals of the Franciscan order. These are not people who are entirely committing themselves to all of the rules that we'll look at later. These are people who work normal jobs. These are, everyday merchant, farmer, whoever in the 1200s says, I want to, focus on caring for the poor, caring for the sick, living a life of simplicity and poverty, but I don't think I'm quite called to go and be a monk, or I'm already married, I'm already whatever. This is a big focus of the Franciscan movement, is that it's emphasizing the role of the lay people in having an active role in the work of the church. So those are the 3 orders. And a few key features of the Franciscan movement is, again, they're committed to a life of poverty. So as we'll see in the rule, the Franciscan could not accept any money from anyone. They were to live a life of begging. Essentially, whatever people would give them, that was all that they would accept. They couldn't work for money. They couldn't even wear shoes unless absolutely necessary. Live a very, very simplistic life. Heavy emphasis on caring for the sick and the poor. So whenever a group of Franciscan itinerant preachers would enter into a city, they would almost always go to, where are the sickest and poorest people in this city, and how can we go and preach the gospel to them? How can we go and share the Christian faith with them? How can we go and provide for their material needs out of what we've been given? How can we care for them? Again, an emphasis on the laity. So when they're going into these places, it's something unique about the Franciscan orders. Unlike, say, the Benedictine order, where you would gather together and live in a monastery, Franciscans don't have monasteries. They don't have a key. Well, over time, some specific groups eventually did, but at this time, the idea was that you didn't have a set location where everyone was just clustering together, but it was actually an opening up into the world. So you could gather together as brothers, as sisters, out in the world while still carrying on your monastic commitments. Additionally, preaching in the language of the people became a heavy emphasis. So I think oftentimes in tellings of histories of the medieval period, especially in Protestant circles, we think that preaching maybe just wasn't really a thing. That's not really true. Preaching actually happened quite often, and the Franciscans are a key example of that. And particularly a focus on preaching in the vernacular, in the language of the people, was a heavy emphasis of the Franciscans. So they would go into whatever town in Italy, and rather than just preaching in Latin, they're going to preach in the language of the people. And this happens throughout Europe, so you get up into the Germanic lands, you get over into England, which already by the 1220s, this is only 15 years later, the Franciscans are already all the way up in England. So it's spreading rapidly, and they're doing so in the language of the people as they're preaching. Again, itinerant preaching, like I said, not confined to monasteries. So in somewhat similar fashion to the horseback riding preachers that we talked about last night, although Franciscans were not allowed to ride horses, they had to walk everywhere barefoot. But they would walk from town to town and preach, and go from town to town to town. Although I think a remarkable difference between the itinerant preachers we talked about yesterday and the Franciscans is when they would get to a town, they would first get permission from the church that existed in that town before they would preach. They would go and explicitly operate within the existing ecclesial structures that were in place at the
Joel,
time.
well, you may not know the answer to this question, but do you know if they lax that rule? Like, say they went to Norway, for example. I mean, like, you can't just go walk around in those shoes. You can do that
In Italy, yeah. I do think as it spreads further, and there's a lot of, in the later centuries, there's a lot of conflict over the extent to which a strict commitment to poverty is important. And so you get different parties. It actually kind of leads to a schism in the church a couple of centuries later, some of these debates. So I do think eventually you do see some laxity in this. And I had a Franciscan friend in England who wore shoes, so. Yeah.
Well, obviously he relaxed it at some point, but I just I wonder
how
like,
quickly.
Was it during Francis's lifetime? It was like, I don't care whether you're in Sweden, you're going no go.
That is a good question. I don't know the answer of how quickly.
Sweden in summer is
That's true. Yeah, and the rule does include a proviso that's like unless necessary. So it's not meant to be like it is meant to be restrictive in the sense of you're committing to something serious and it's to hold you accountable, but to the extent that it would get in the way of going and actually fulfilling the mission of caring for the poor and preaching.
I'm supposing shoes may be the most expensive clothing item every time.
That is also correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Shoes would have been very expensive as well, and so as a sign of poverty, the poor people that they are helping likely would not have had shoes, or if they did, would have been very, very bare bones kind of shoes. So, that's a very good point.
Joe, I also have a question along this line.
Yeah.
So, based on kind of like on your research, like how many scholars do they disagree? A lot of those kind of, some of them are legend and some of them are true about some of the things they said about him. Is
Like some of the myths.
Yeah.
No, I think there's obviously a lot of debate, and I think unlike say the period that we were talking about yesterday in the 1800s, we're now 800 years removed from this, and so we do have less sources. Sources break down over time, they get lost, whatever. We do have a fairly remarkable amount of sources from St. Mary's. Like we have original kind of writings from him stored in archives. So yes, some of it I think it's definitely debated among people of whether some of the more miraculous signs were real, were they more legend. It's probably some mix of both. I have a quote in here in a little bit that we'll read, but G.K. Chesterton has a biography of St. Francis where he talks about how do we understand the kind of mythical or miraculous side of St. Francis when we also know he was a real person. And I think it has a really good treatment of what that process looks like of teasing those things out.
For example, with him carrying rock to the other church, if that is true, I want to know what's the reaction of the Pope or the Catholic Church with that? Because at that point he will be doing something like independent, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and that's a good point because at this time there were also a lot of movements in this period that were seen to be heretical from the perspective of the Catholic Church. So you had some dualistic groups in southern France that were seen to be a threat to the church. So a lot of people were, this is kind of the south of France. And so there are some groups popping up. And this is in part why Francis himself wants to operate within.
Is that the Waldensians?
Waldensians would be another group as well that were declared heretical around the same time.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So there are some groups that are popping up that are seen to be a threat from the Catholic Church, and Francis is part of why he goes to the Pope in 1209 so early on to get permission. Is he wants to say, hey, I don't want to be seen as someone who's just striking out on my own and doing I want to be held accountable. I want to be operating within the order of the Catholic Church. So I think had he continued doing that without then going to the Pope and had gained a following, then my guess is we would be talking about him as a group like the Waldensians or others who were a group declared heretical by the church at the time. So additional feature, like I said, the movement spread very rapidly and included a lot of missionary work throughout Europe, into the Middle East, into Africa. Francis himself went with the Fifth Crusade to Arabia to go and preach the Christian faith during that period. They also founded schools of theology, places like Paris and Oxford. In Oxford, they went to the kind of poorest quarter of the city when they got there and founded a study center, had a chapel, church there. Ironically, the location where that church stood is now a very high-end shopping mall. But if you go there, when they were doing excavation work for this high-end shopping mall, they uncovered the floor tiles of the original Franciscan church there. And so if you go there, they're kind of plastered up on the wall. They have an exhibit about them, which is kind of neat to see. But yeah, so they very rapidly spread across Europe. So it's a very quick movement across that long distances. So some of the long-term impacts of the Franciscan movement. First, I think from Protestant perspective, I think there's an argument to be made that Francis was a sort of proto-Protestant reformer, that he emphasized a lot of things that in later centuries would be hallmarks of people like Luther, people like John Huss, people like Calvin, Zwingli, etc. Particularly with a heavy emphasis on the lay involvement in the work of the church, focusing on not just priests being the ones who can communicate with God, not being the only ones who can partake in the work of the church, but saying no, like everyday merchant, farmer, blacksmith Joe is a valuable member of the family of God and can contribute in mighty ways to the work of the church that's going on. And then a second important emphasis being the focus on preaching in the vernacular and the translation of Scripture into the language that everyday people can understand. Now, the Franciscans do not give a full vernacular translation of the Scriptures. This, you have to wait a little bit longer for people like Wycliffe or others to do some of this translation work in full, but certainly in the preaching that they're doing. So when they go to Mass at a church and then they have the preaching time, they're doing so in the vernacular. They're doing so translating the Bible verses into language that people can understand and then explaining what's happening there. So again, definitely something that you're going to see a lot more emphasis on in the information. Devotional practices, long term, that have been passed down from the Franciscans would be Stations of the Cross. If you've ever partaken in a Stations of the Cross kind of prayer service, that has origins in St. Francis and some of the liturgies he put together. Singing in general in the church obviously existed far before this, but with St. Francis being a poet, hymns, singing became an emphasis of the movement. And like I said before, we still sing songs that are downstream from him. And then additionally, the Franciscan orders remain active today. There are about 650,000 Franciscans in the world across 110 different countries, primarily focused on caring for the poor. Something we didn't quite get into that Francis is also known for is his care for creation, his care for animals, birds, etc. And so that throughout the history of the Franciscan movement has been an emphasis, is caring for the poor and caring for creation alongside that. So those are a few of the long-term impacts. And then the 1223 rule of St. Francis with G.K. Chesterton's quote that I was talking about. He was a lover. He was a lover of God, and he was really and truly a lover of men. Possibly a much rarer mystical vocation. A lover of men is nearly the opposite of a philanthropist. Indeed, the pedantry of the Greek word carries something like a satire on itself. A philanthropist may be said to love anthropoids. But St. Francis did not love humanity, but men. So he did not love Christianity, but Christ. Say, if you think so, that he was a lunatic loving an imaginary person. But an imaginary person, not an imaginary idea. And for the modern reader, the clue to the asceticism and all the rest can best be found in the stories of lovers, when they seem to be rather like lunatics. Love it. Yeah, and like I said, highly recommend this biography if you want to read it. Yeah.
Where would you say this biography? It seems brief, at least in the one that's on our shelf. So
Yeah.
wants to borrow it. Where does it rank in terms of other biographies on St. Francis?
It's a much more devotional biography, in the sense of, I think Chesterton is writing like explicitly for the edification of people from a spiritual perspective. I think if you want a kind of historical critical take on to what extent the miracles were necessarily true or not, I think Chesterton does a great job of like addressing that, but that's not his focus. There are a lot of other kind of more academic biographies that will dive into some more of that.
He's a new light, and those are the old lights.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So yeah, it's definitely more on the devotional side of things as a biography.
Just as an aside for my information, G.K. Chesterton, when he wrote about Thomas Aquinas, he was pretty negative on him, right?
I think he was a little bit negative. I haven't read his like any of his biographies of
But I mean, those are close to being contemporaries, know.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure Chesterton doesn't like Aquinas, but liked Francis. I'm not sure why.
Interesting. Okay, I have to look into that. Yeah, and I think bringing up Aquinas is a good example because kind of parallel to St. Francis and the Franciscans is the Dominican order. So you might have heard the terms Grey Friars and Black Friars. Grey Friars would be Franciscans because the outfit that they wear, which is essentially like a burlap sack with a rope tied around it and a hood, theirs would be more gray or brown, and then the Dominicans would wear black and but a very similar look. And so those are two movements that are happening parallel. The Dominicans also being mendicants, which means mendicant is just you cannot accept any money from people, so you're kind of traveling around begging, asking people for money, just living off of what people give you. So both of these movements happen, but with different emphases. So Francis being particularly some of the like care for the poor, focused on the laity. Dominicans being a little bit more focused on preaching in particular and academic study, which is why you get someone like Aquinas coming out of the Dominicans and someone like Francis obviously being the main person in this movement. So, yeah. Any questions on any of that? I know that was brief. I'm also by no means an expert on Franciscan movement, so you probably have a lot of questions I don't have answers to, but I have a list of books that I want to read that I can also give to you. So,
You're closer than what we have access to currently in this room right now. So
All right.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. Cool. Well, what I would like for us to do then is I have printed out just two pages of the original rule of the Franciscan order. So Francis at one point wrote up a rule to kind of guide his followers of this is what we are committing ourselves to in 1209. That is lost to history. We don't really know exactly what was in that rule. People have tried to kind of piece together based off of the writing fragments we do have what exactly that was. But what we do have is the official rule of 1223 that was approved by the Roman Catholic Church. This is the rule that Franciscans to this day, if they join the order, are committing themselves to. That is in that first order, the monks. But yeah, so we're going to read a couple of chapters from that. I'll pass these out. I might have to share a few people in the room. But we'll read this, take a couple minutes to think about it, and then I've got a couple of discussion questions, and we'll chat. So. What are your impressions, thoughts after reading this? Like I said, this is selected chapters, so we're obviously skipping over some chapters as we're reading this. But what are some thoughts? What stands out?
Is this specifically for that first order? With
Correct. Yeah. This would not be to the laity.
Yeah. Got it.
Yeah.
It's like the mob, once you're in, you can't get out.
Yeah. You cannot leave.
But
Which
you
is
need a year to test it out.
Yes, which is usually why you have a novitiate, which is a year term where you're a novice testing out whether or not you're going to join. So like I had a friend who thought he was going to join the priesthood, did a year's worth of training, and realized this is not the calling for me, and so then left. Yeah.
It's the inverse of the Amish who send their children out for a time to see whether they really want to stay.
To stay, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that there's no sense in which Francis is trying to force this rule on anyone.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone who is taking this is doing so because they really, really want to do it.
If I had to be old lightish,
Yeah.
like the first thing I would say, it seems like that part of this, especially as it relates to marriage, seems contrary to what Paul teaches in 1 Corinthians 6 about marriage So that part of it, it's like, you know, again, I think that we're all figuring this out as we go along and trying to hold all that we see in Scripture together.
Yeah.
But that part of it's just like, wait a second, this isn't just extra biblical, it may be anti-biblical.
Yeah.
And that part of it.
Yeah.
You know, and I believe in the possibility that some people are called to celibacy and all that, but the way I wonder why they did it this way as it relates to marriage.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a really good point.
I think the chapter 6 stuff is very much like an unqualified taking Jesus at his word and Sermon on the Mount and other teachings on money. It's like, like we're not, like it's just like that. I don't know. I've been reading a book recently called The Anti-Greed Gospel. And I think he just kind of, it makes a lot of points about how much, even in our culture, because we're so beholden to material things and wealth and pursuing of that and kind of sanctifying that, like how we should really feel more uncomfortable by those things. And so I was struck by that. And then also how much betting there was of people coming, like sort of the opposite of what we were looking at yesterday, where it's like some dude in the backwoods gets on horseback and starts preaching. There's a lot of betting, and then I was also even struck by the instructions on preaching, like give a few short words, but almost that there's more emphasis on like preaching via action. It feels like the different steps they're taking.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Speaking of which, is this quote really by Francis? Now, I heard it was by him, the whole idea, like, preach the gospel and use word if necessary. Some people say
I've heard
not,
that too.
but...
Yeah, I don't know if that is, I think it would be very hard to confirm if that actually was him or not. I've also heard it attributed to other people other than Francis, so I think it's a generally admirable quote that people have given to lots of different
I guess
people.
with the vow, it makes sense why they think it's him, you know,
Yeah.
the whole idea of poverty. And
Exactly.
But also with the order, how much of it actually, how formal was it established with him? Is it really started with him, or is it his followers who really...
It really is him doing it. It becomes more formalized, especially after this rule is approved, and they start to bring in some other kind of... Francis himself was not like a big administrator. He wanted to go and, you know, be poor and preach the gospel to lepers, and so he wasn't really interested in doing all of the like formal, work of the institution stuff, and so other people then come in and formalize some of that, some during his lifetime, and then carrying on.
So the order did kick off with his time.
It definitely, yeah, it did. The order was formed, like he was the person who went to the Pope to get official sanction for the order. Yeah.
I was struck not necessarily by, well, I was struck by the lack of, right, like you could kind of draw a line through, these people are benefiting in the Second Great Awakening, right? You could see where there was monetary gain for a lot of the big players with the Second Great Awakening. And so for those reasons, I often tend more old, like a little more skeptical. But with this one, it was interesting for Jeremiah to bring up the skepticism that he had about it. But this one, I was much more on board, being like, oh yeah, this was it. This was what it was, right?
Yeah, because of the lack of the money issue.
Because I don't feel like Francis was benefiting from this, right? Like I feel like he was kind of slowing himself down, right, for not pursuing what he wanted to pursue, in order to bring other people along with him.
Yeah. Other thoughts? Anything? I have a couple of other questions as well. In what ways does the Franciscan movement fit or not with our understanding of revival? We don't have to totally limit ourselves to that working definition we talked about yesterday, but in what ways does it fit or not with what we think of when we think of revival?
Well, certainly people felt that experience of God. Yeah. And then to take drastic action.
Yeah.
Also sort of kind of like the idea of renewing how we see things, spiritually reforming how we see things, like with the whole idea of taking poverty, for example, and showing love, and kind of like with more emphasis on community rather than just preaching words. So.
Yeah.
Well, it was also going against the what was in vogue with the church at that time. At the time Franciscans were formed, the Pope was amassing temporal power. Like he even had like the papal states as his own country. So for him, it's kind of like challenging. Like we don't need this. We don't need all the riches and the glory and everything, the political power. We just need to be like more simple, and that's a challenge to like what people thought churches were. And like this time in history when like all the rich people were like in front and all the poor people were at the back.
Yeah.
And like
Absolutely.
the masses were being preached in Latin, nobody understood it. Only the rich people had like access to education. So it was more of like a challenge of like bringing the church to the people and distilling it in such a way that we get rid of all of these trappings of power and excesses, and like we just bring just the gospel.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very, very much a challenge. Which then maybe we could skip to this last question. How does Francis's desire to achieve reform from within the confines of the established church challenge your thinking about the roles that revivals can take? Because I think you're absolutely right. He is challenging this, but as we read in the final chapter on this page, it was like if you don't get approval from the bishop, like you can't preach. What do you make of that desire to still operate within the confines?
So one thing I just wanted to just relate to this question. I noticed that I can't remember the number you had up there. It was like, it was how many millions of Franciscans are there in the world?
650,000. In that first order, yeah.
No, but today. How many?
Today, yeah.
650,000 Franciscans today.
Correct. Yeah.
So, and now last night you showed the Pentecostal movement, and you're talking about maybe there are more Pentecostals than there are people in the United States.
Yeah.
And more than likely. And so there is a sense in which I think that revivals can take on a real role within an established order, and within, but that is automatically going to be limited, and the established order has all sorts of vested interests to keep that fringe. So again, that's kind of one of the things. It's like, in one respect, there is some legitimacy that he had to have derived from staying within the Catholic Church. That if he hadn't, it would have been squashed out.
Yeah.
And I'm not minimizing him at all. But to go back to Brandon's point, yes, personally, Francis was an amazing example, and the people that were following him were amazing. But there was some level of reliance upon the power of the church to actually become a thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
I imagine it moved quite slow compared to if he had busted out of it too. Like I think today we have a pressure for revival to be moving, but similar to kind of the Second Great Awakening or even the first. Last night being struck by the decades long observation of it. I think within the confines of the established church is just going to be slower.
Be a slower process. Yeah.
Also I noticed like with him, it's also showing revival is always about reformation, not necessarily like within the church, like it's about purification or making people do things. I'm thinking about, for example, even with Luther, along with the Reformation. Of course, the Reformation is not necessarily revival in the sense of revival, but it's always within the church. Like I want to see things do the right way, not necessarily study something and go against the authority in the world.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
One more thing too, his trip to join the Sixth Crusade. I forgot there even was a Sixth Crusade. You know what I mean? Was it as violent?
I don't think it was as violent as the earlier ones. I'm assuming there was definitely some violence involved.
Right.
But yeah.
I don't know. I'd just be interested in how he, calls. I mean, that's the thing about St. Francis. We read his poems. It's like, man, was he a pantheist? He's almost like he's talking about the birds and their sisters, and and all that kind of stuff. And then realistically, that's actually I think a legitimate way to speak. That's how you defend it. It's like, hey, he's not fellow creation. That's how we would say it.
Yeah.
Fellow creation, and all that. But there's a part of it's like, again, I'm actually really new light on Francis, by the way, just personally speaking. But I also do have, going back to the revival in the pre-Reformation context.
Yeah.
It's almost like we almost would like to be able to have a conversation with St. Francis and all the people that really know him. Like, what do you think? Realistically, you can't overthrow the Catholic Church yet. Like, how much?
Yeah.
Would he have been glad to see Huss and Luther and all those guys?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, which in some ways it's also helpful to keep in mind that Luther and Huss and the others, these others, like it was not part of their agenda to split from the Catholic Church. They didn't set out thinking we need to overthrow the Catholic Church. Like you said, Kissy, it's an effort to reform from within, and it really was only until pushed to the brink that Luther made a break. Yeah.
That does make me wonder how much we can attribute, right? 'Cause, specifically within the Franciscan order, we see 650,000. But then, right, like the whole Protestant movement, right? If he is really proto-Protestant and informs that much, you know, we could trace a lot of our faith heritage back then to that Franciscan movement.
Well, and I'm thinking too, like the 650,000, that's monks. Right?
Those are monks, yes.
And
So that
it's
doesn't
like
include
not
the lay
including
orders.
It's not including lay orders. It's also not including like all the people whose lives were transformed by St. Francis. Like what happened in the communities they went to, the hospitals that the Franciscans
Correct.
created,
Yeah.
all this kind of stuff that the imprint remains and much
Yeah.
broader
Which
than just the 650.
to convince 650,000 to
Be
accept
monks.
this
Yeah.
rule is pretty remarkable.
Yes. Yep. There you go. I wasn't catching what that number meant.
Yeah. So that's people who live under this rule.
Which is
Okay.
great.
Yeah.
That's
Which
much
is a lot of people.
Yeah, that
A
is.
lot of people.
Yeah.
What'd you say?
Two mix.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to know how many people over the history were married and then took that order.
Yeah, I would
too.
would be very curious actually. I'll have to look into that. Yeah.
I was also thinking one other random thing, the difference in like how the messages and how they started, like this versus the Second Great Awakening, like how like like G.K. Chesterton said he was a lover and he just loved people, loved God's creation, loved all this. And then was it the sinners in the hand of an angry God being the start of the Second Great Awakening, which is like wildly different. And like one seems very I just think that's interesting.
Yeah. Now to Edward's defense, the term beauty shows up in a remarkable number of times in the works that he has, and so I think the love was definitely there.
Yeah.
Maybe not particularly an emphasis in that exact sermon, but yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
I think I know there's been a lot of comments, but I'll just add that.
Yeah, go for it.
I think it's a good example to include because it is more formal and under the leadership of the church. So I think when I initially think of revival, I'm like, oh, this is always like a fast and just like passionate and very, probably unorganized to some extent movement. Whereas this, I think, just helps provide the example that it can be very thoughtful as well, and formalized in something we're reading 1,000 years later. So
Yeah.
It's a revival with a lot of gatekeepers at the beginning.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
This is just nobody thinks about revival that way, right? But there's got to be some like, hey, this is what it means.
Right.
For revival to happen, even if I don't like the marital.
Yeah.
And also too, Joel, most of the big revival that happened, like the way opening, people wasn't set up and said we're gonna start a revival. Like it just sort of happened. They like we wanna do that, and all of a sudden we name it revival. But for them, that's not what.
Right at the beginning, St. Francis could have said he could have seen a situation where only like 4 people joined him. Four people that had nothing to lose. Okay, I'll do this.
Yeah, and then they could have starved to death out in the Italian countryside because no one gave them anything. Like, very, very easily could have started. Yeah, absolutely.
I don't have shoes anyways.
It's true. Yeah, absolutely. I think that we covered all of these. Yeah. Any other thoughts on St. Francis? I know the question, how well does the term revival work in a Reformation context, or what does it feel like to think about the idea of revival reform kind of in a pre-1517 context? What does that feel like to do?
People have more constraints on what they think that teaching would be, because the church was so pervasive not only in their spiritual life but also in their political life. Like they can be ostracized socially if they consider heretics.
Yeah.
So I feel like people have more like they have more restraint when it comes to like what they would think as like new teaching versus like what they would consider as like liberated teaching. Like I don't think like liberation was a thing back then because they have to be like they just have like more constraints.
What's period you say?
1300s. Yeah.
I feel like it's focused more on people, community, things like that, where later, like one Reformation, I feel it's focused more kind of like theology, way of seeing, teaching, and challenge the church.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
And I think like part of the implied question is, as Protestants, how much do we feel, at least that's how I'm reading the question, like how much do I trust this given the Catholic baggage? And for me, obviously, I was joking about prior to 1517, there'd be no revival that happened before that because Acts 2 happened before that, and all sorts of it, and St. Patrick. So for me, I look at it and I would say there's a whole lot to learn here, even with that kind of like, in fact, there's something that I can maybe take away a little bit more, given a revival happened within what I see as like a whole lot of outward oppression for what should be right and possible. Whereas now we don't face that. You don't have to be under the people that have taken upon themselves the right to call themselves the church.
Yeah.
And so in one respect, I have more to learn from St. Francis because he had to figure out how to bring it back. He had to figure it out revival, to his point. He did something that led to revival, even in the midst of all of this difficulty that we don't face.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I think if you're a Roman Catholic, you can tend to view the history of the Reformation as like things were great in the medieval period, and then Luther messed a bunch of stuff up, and it's been chaos since. And if you're a Protestant, you think there was nothing good happening until 1517, and then finally things were freed. And it's somewhere in between those two. And I think as Protestants, we do have a lot to learn from the medieval period and the brothers and sisters in our family who were following Christ during that period as well.
I'll say it wasn't something maybe like in the last 4 years that I feel like I really started to learn anything about the medieval period. So I just feel like there's just like a black box in most of our brains at least.
Yeah. Likewise. Yeah.
I mean, we call it the Dark Ages. We call it medieval. I mean, it's the whole idea. Even not just the Protestant Reformation, but also the Renaissance actually treated that whole section of history
as just the Dark Ages.
Yeah, it's a terrible time where nothing good was happening.
Yeah.
And that's not the case. Yeah.
I want to ask this question, mostly not just from by everyone. Like, what can you say? Like, today we find people who sort of kind of leave the Catholic Church and say, "Oh, I was Catholic, and now I'm Christian." And sometimes they tend to divide like, every Catholic is not Christian. If you're Catholic, that means you're not Christian, you're not going to heaven. How can you clarify this for us and saying like, Catholic may be different, practice different than us, but not really, is there a way you can kind of...
I think two points to that. One would be, I think, if you look at the scope of Protestantism as it currently exists, I think most people in this room probably have a lot more in common with Roman Catholics than they do with some quadrants of Protestantism. And secondly, I think, where was the second point I was going to make? I'm blanking.
Something about salvation.
Secondly, I think if you look at some of the early reformers like Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, any of these leaders, they kind of almost all of them. It's not really until you get to some of the much more radical Anabaptist phase of the Reformation that these leaders do believe that the Catholic Church the true church exists within the Catholic Church, is how they would put it. They all think like, yes, we don't like it. I mean, if you read some of Luther's stuff when he's talking about the Roman Catholic Church or the Pope, like he's very very opposed.
He's the devil.
He is the devil. That it gets very very heated, but nonetheless, they still hold that the true church consists within the Roman Catholic Church, as they would say it exists within the Eastern Orthodox churches or the Syrian Orthodox Church or whatever. let's talk about Pentecostalism.
Yes.
How many people here have heard of Azusa Street before? Okay, so everyone has heard of Azusa Street. Cool. This is the place on Azusa Street where the Azusa Street revival happened. This is the old, it was an old African Methodist Episcopal church that had been run down, potentially condemned. It was essentially like a barn. They kept horses in it and stuff, so that's where it happened, but we'll get into that. Cool, so Azusa Street is known as the kind of birth of the Pentecostal movement, the global Pentecostal movement. Pentecostalism itself had started a little bit prior to this as a movement with some leaders that we'll get into. But this is all taking place in early 1900s in Los Angeles, California. Some historical context and roots of what's going on here. Shortly after the Azusa Street revival breaks out, the San Francisco earthquake happens. So this is, like we talked about before, massive societal changes happening, dramatic events. Some people think that the reason why the Azusa Street revival grew as rapidly as it did is in part because of the great destruction that people were seeing happening in San Francisco. On the converse, another interpretation would be that the earthquake was a sign of God pouring out wrath on people, but also announcing something new is happening. So those are kind of two takes on the potential role of the earthquake. This is also a period of rapid urbanization. You can see on the right here, this is a picture from San Francisco around that time period. People are pouring into America's cities as industrialization is happening. America is becoming a massive industrial powerhouse. And then on the kind of religious side of things, the Azusa Street revivals are coming out of a movement within the kind of Wesleyan Methodist tradition known as the Holiness Movement. So this is a strain within the Methodist Church that took some of what Charles Wesley had talked about being kind of Christian perfectionism, that at some point in one's life, through the work of the Holy Spirit and sanctification, one can achieve a state where they're not sinning any longer. And so the Holiness Movement becomes kind of out of the Second Great Awakening that we were talking about earlier, in the post-Civil War period, starts to grow in places like Kansas. Texas has a decent-sized movement of this. Kind of all over scattered about, there are these movements of the Holiness Wesleyan tradition. And then additionally, something that directly influenced the Azusa Street revival was news of the Welsh revivals that were happening in the early 1900s, about 1902, in some of the poor mining country in Wales. You saw thousands and thousands of people converting to Christianity, open air preaching. A lot of the similar kinds of things that we talked about in the Second Great Awakening are happening in Wales. And so there's actually direct correspondence between some of the leaders of the Azusa Street revival and people who were there in Wales, kind of witnessing what was going on. And so some of these things are connected, not just within the United States, but also abroad as well. So I've got a couple pictures just to give us some context of what's happening. 1903, first airplane, so things are changing. Yes, North Carolina. My fun fact, my grandpa's been on a plane crash in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina before. Yeah, it was a small airplane and the landing gear didn't work. So,
Second grade field trip.
What?
Second grade field trip.
That's a cool field trip. Okay. And my grandpa is from Dayton, which is why it was interesting because these guys are also from Dayton. But so yeah. Anyways, the world is rapidly changing. Humans can fly now. That is going to change the way a lot of people even think about what's going on. What is this industrial technology going to do to us as a people, as a human race? This is also the time of Theodore Roosevelt, a kind of more muscular American foreign policy. America is coming into its own. It's becoming much wealthier, much more militarily powerful. This is also the time of the industrial giants. This is one of the most famous cartoons of the period. Essentially, that the monopolists of the various industries kind of have the power. They're the ones who are running Congress, not the Congress people. This is in the back of people's minds. It's starting to move into the progressive era where people are talking about we need to do something about this, trust busting, antitrust. I get my day job because of laws that are passed during this time period, which is nice. This is a picture of San Francisco earthquake. I think a lot of times people don't realize just how destructive it was. It wrecked almost everything. It was bad. And then because of the way that things were built at the time, things caught on fire after the earthquake. And so, extremely destructive earthquake. And in part, I think for us, it can sometimes be helpful to think about some of these natural disasters akin to the way that when 9/11 happened, churches were very quickly filled with a lot more people. And so this is something that's happening around the same time that Azusa Street is happening. This is a picture of the Welsh Revival. It looks fairly similar. This is actually a photograph, not just a painting, but it looks pretty similar to some of the stuff we saw about Second Great Awakening. A lot of the similar kinds of influences were at work over there. And that then brings us to how Pentecost came to Los Angeles, which is the way that one eyewitness and participant described. So Frank Bartleman, he was one of the participants in the Azusa Street revivals, and he has a nice book where he talks about the histories, and so we'll get some stuff from that. He writes, "The present Pentecostal manifestation did not break out in a moment, like a huge prairie fire, and set the world on fire. In fact, no work of God ever appears that way. There's a necessary time for preparation. The finished article is not realized at the beginning. Men may wonder where it came from, not being conscious of the preparation, but there's always such. Every movement of the Spirit of God must always run the gauntlet of the devil's forces." And so, in 1909, there was a group of Pentecostal Christians, people who had come under the influence of this Wesleyan holiness movement, who specifically believed in the third baptism, or the baptism of the Holy Spirit, specifically manifest in the speaking of tongues. And they were praying in a small house on North Bonnie Bray Street, which you can actually go see to this day. And they were praying for several days. They actually had a planned 3-week fast. They were 5 days into this fast. They had several weeks of preaching nightly together, and they were in a time of prayer, specifically praying to receive this baptism of the Holy Spirit, to pray in tongues, and they, per the eyewitness accounts, did. Someone in the group eventually began speaking in tongues, began shouting, praising, and then several others in quick succession followed. The neighbors were alarmed at the loud noises coming from the house, and over the next few days, people started gathering in, and the house became too small to hold everyone, and that's then when they moved over to that old African Methodist Episcopal building, where then for the next 3 years they had essentially a continual revival service for what was going on. 3 years. 3 years of kind of continual preaching, and one aspect of this revival that I think is interesting is the eyewitness accounts talk about a lot of silence, a lot of silent time. So it wasn't just a lot of singing, it wasn't always very loud, it would be sometimes for hours, just people sitting silent.
That's why we need to play in Agape. Beat me to it.
So a couple of key features of what are happening as these groups are, this group is rapidly growing. Speaking in tongues is probably the most kind of unique aspect of what's going on here. This is one of the key markers of modern Pentecostalism. It was one of the big emphases there. In fact, the leader of this movement, the preacher who kind of got things kicked off, William Seymour, who we'll look at in the next slide, when he came and preached, he preached specifically on this idea of the baptism of the Holy Spirit and speaking in tongues. Like I said, extended services of prayer, preaching and singing, a lot of silence. This is a very interdenominational gathering. Like I said, a lot of Wesleyan holiness movement people there, but also Baptists, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, you name it, are kind of gathered in and are in some ways thinking, well, what's going on here? I need to go check out what's happening here as the news is spreading quickly. Male and female preaching and leadership was shared. So of the 12 elders or leaders of the movement, 6 of them were women. So a very kind of egalitarian in that way, sharing leadership. and as you look at the long-term trajectory of Pentecostalism, that has remained the case, that men and women take on prominent roles in leadership within Pentecostalism. And then one of the things that was particularly remarkable at the time, which later led to some conflict, was it was an incredibly racially integrated gathering of people, which the United States in the early 1900s, very racially segregated. But in these gatherings, especially because it was in California, you would have not just whites and blacks gathered together, but Latinos, you'd have Asian immigrants, you'd have all sorts of people from all over the world, which is why people talk about and use the terms Pentecost as a gathering, to describe this gathering, because there were so many different people from so many different countries gathered in LA, which is again a product of some of this urbanization, some of the economic growth that's happening, that you have, hundreds of different backgrounds all together in a city that can participate in a movement like this. So one of the key leaders was William J. Seymour. He was raised in the South, came under the influence of a Pentecostal leader in Kansas who was trained under him. And Frank Bartleman writes of the way that he acted in some of these revival services. Brother Seymour generally sat behind two empty shoeboxes, one on top of the other. He usually kept his head inside the top one during the meeting in prayer. There was no pride there. So he's essentially putting a box over his face so as not to be seen as the personality that's driving this, to say the Holy Spirit is the one who's doing this. I'm not the one. It's not about William Seymour. It's about God. It's about the Holy Spirit. The services ran almost continuously. Seeking souls could be found under the power almost any hour, night and day. The people came to meet God. He was always there. Hence a continuous meeting. The meeting did not depend on the human leaders. Obviously, Frank Bartleman, being a member of this movement, believes that that's the case, believes that it's very independent of the leaders, and to some eyewitnesses, that absolutely was the case. Others did not think as much. We get that new light, old night controversy. But nonetheless, William J. Seymour, fairly remarkable figure. A couple of other key leaders. William's wife was also a preacher and organizer, Jenny Evans. Frank Bartleman was the person who had kind of trained William Seymour. He was one of the key Pentecostal leaders. That's Charles Parham. Frank Bartleman, preacher organizer, he's the one who we're getting some of this evidence from. Charles Parham was a prominent Pentecostal leader and Seymour's teacher. They would later split, as we'll see later, over some of this racial integration of the meetings. And Lucy Farrow was another key leader. She was a preacher, former slave, and actually the niece of Frederick Douglass. So she was also participating in this movement and was one of those 6 female elders of the movement. And as the movement kind of solidified, again, we said it was 3 years, it kind of became a kind of mission church there. And then as the Azusa Street movement itself kind of died down by 1912 or so, it transitioned into being a church, and William Seymour preached at that church for another 10, 15 years until the end of his career. So it kind of settles down and solidifies as a unique church there. But, like I said, it was not without controversy at all. So on the left here, we have a headline from the newspaper. So the newspapers in the early 1900s was this was the Twitter of the day. This was how you got your news out. The Apostolic Faith was the newspaper of the Azusa Street Revival Pentecostal movement. They had a large list of subscribers, and they were publishing news updates, trying to get people to come in. So here you can see Pentecost has come. We'll read a little bit from that first episode, or that first edition in a little bit. And then on the right here, we see from the Los Angeles Times a few days later, after this is starting to drum up a lot of interest in the area, that a new sect of fanatics is breaking loose. Wild scene last night on Azusa Street. Gargle of wordless talk by a sister. So you can see that there were a lot of people who were seeing what was going on as a little crazy, a little out there, potentially even concerning. It's also worth noting that this is happening in one of the poorest quadrants of LA. So from the viewpoint of kind of the people who have power in LA, it's something crazy is happening over in that neighborhood that's not a great neighborhood, and that's how it's being viewed. There's also significant racial conflict that happened. The Assemblies of God, which is one of the largest Pentecostal denominations, in 1914 actually split from the Interracial Church of God in Christ, which was kind of what was formed out of It was formed prior to Azusa Street, but was what William Seymour was a part of. And then Charles Parham, who was actually the leader of William Seymour, he rejected the work of his student once he got there with some extreme racial vitriol. Said there was a beautiful. Actually, I'm just gonna have you guys read that one. If you wanna take a read there, but we can see.
It's really sad now. Isn't like California one of the most liberal places in the U.S. in terms of Christianity?
Mm-hmm. But yeah, so Charles Parham, not a fan of some of this racial integration that is happening. In particular, the ways that the Pentecostal movement that he was a part of started to take on some of the features of the black church that had developed in the South. And so you see a significant division within Pentecostalism between the kind of white church and the black church that exists mainly to this day.
You said he was the one that trained
William Seymour, correct? Yeah. So he was his teacher, and then they had a kind of massive falling out as a result.
That's after this,
Oh,
or
like
did that happen before this? The falling out.
The falling out was kind of right after this. Yeah.
Oh.
Essentially, William Seymour was preaching at Azusa Street, and Charles Parham showed up to see what was going on, and did not like what he was seeing. So
basically, the AG split off because they didn't like that it was integration.
In part, yes. Yeah. They wanted to be able to control their own kind of denomination along some of those more racially segregated lines. Yeah. And so and you see that again, kind of to this day. The Churches of God in Christ is a predominantly black denomination in the United States, and the Assemblies of God is a very white denomination. So that happens pretty early on. So some of this, the racial integration doesn't hold for very long. Some of the long-term impact of the Azusa Street revival, several new denominations come out of this, like we said, the Assemblies of God, the Church of God in Christ, also the Foursquare Church, led by one of the more famous evangelist preachers at the time, Amy Semple McPherson, which if you are interested in seeing some very excited preaching on stage, some videos and some of Amy Semple McPherson's sermons are really interesting to watch. Similarly, like I said before, Pentecostalism is one of the fastest growing religious movements on earth. It is particularly rapidly growing in Africa, in South Asia, in South America. This here is a church in Nigeria, is one of the largest churches there. You can see there are thousands of people there. Some of these Pentecostal churches, there's a large Pentecostal church in Indonesia that numbers anywhere between 30 to 40,000 members. That's not uncommon for some of these large movements. And like I said, approximately 300 million Pentecostals globally. That's kind of a lowball estimate. I think given the rapid growth, some scholars would estimate it to be 600 to 650 million at the top end. So we're talking twice the size of the United States potentially. So it's a significant percentage of people who call themselves Christians in the world are Pentecostals that are part of these churches. That's all I've got on kind of content. We're going to read some of the eyewitness accounts from that first episode of the Apostolic Faith newspaper. But do we have any questions before we jump into that?
The newspaper is called the Apostolic Faith?
Yes.
And is it, like, who was publishing it?
So this was mainly Charles Seymour and Lucy Farrow were...
It's kind of like their publication.
Their publication, yeah. It's their way of getting the word out of what's going on. So, so we'll go ahead and read the next 2 pages in your packet, and then we'll get together and talk. All right. Thoughts? What stands out to you? What's hitting you from this page?
There it is.
I enjoyed that they could understand the first chapter of Ephesians
Great.
after receiving the Pentecost.
I don't understand this chapter of Ephesians, and we've been studying it for 2 months.
I
I did think it was interesting, it's one thing to keep in mind, there is a very strong theological argument here about the role of sanctification, perfection, that, like you already said, but that's a big part of what's happening. You know, we saw the racial strife, but there is a real strife over, okay, what's happening in sanctification to us.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's what birthed all of this. And I think most of us would disagree with them, but there is a strong argument being made.
Yeah. About a very clear manifestation of this sanctifying power. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, the last part of the article talks about like the Pentecostals come and like what does the church think of it? Like it kind of like makes me think about the times that we've prayed for certain things and we're expecting God to answer them in certain ways, and God didn't answer them in certain ways. Like you know, like we grew up praying for the 1040 window. Those 1040 window people are coming over to the U.S. and what are we doing? It's like we're packing them up and putting them in concentration camps. Like God didn't answer their prayers. Those people are coming over here to be preached at, and like we're not doing what we're supposed to do.
Yeah.
I was kind of struck by this one and the last one. It felt like there were different metrics of, or like, I don't know if legalism is the right term, but there's like certain boxes to check of like doing these things. Yeah, there's and then Franciscans, like these different commitments you're making, and then the evidences of the Holy Spirit and whether or not you've been baptized and stuff. Which I don't know if I just didn't see that in the Second Great Awakening when we looked at that, but
yeah, here there's a pretty clear like
there's very
line.
discrete. We're looking for these
Correct.
things, whether it's you're committing to taking 2 tunics or you've received Pentecost.
Yes.
So when they said they were praying for the Pentecost, what exactly had they had in mind before that?
I mean, I think you mean like when they're sitting down to pray.
Yeah, like what were they expecting when they said the Pentecost come? Was they having like a
Acts 2, Acts 2 point, Acts 2 1.1, or
Yeah, some new iteration of
okay,
that.
so they were expecting the same event.
They were using Acts 2 as like whatever happened there, we want to see that. We want to see what happened there. We want what they described happened there to be able to describe what is happening here.
And there are a lot of different leaders, is that correct? Like
Correct.
From different churches.
Yes.
So they come like each of them is like have a different congregation and different denomination. Right?
Yeah, so that does happen. As the movement solidifies, you start to see some kind of institutionalization over time.
And now they go back to their own institution. Do they retain the same denomination they were part of, or do they kind of like?
That's a good question. I think a lot of times no. I think a lot of times it's like, okay, we're now going to join in on like the New Assemblies of God becomes one of the more quickly growing denominations in the U.S. over time.
I'm referring to the event in Los Angeles.
In Los Angeles particularly, I'm not sure exactly like if a specific pastor comes there or whatever, if he's going to go back and keep his church in the congregation. I do know one of the long-term impacts I didn't mention is that the emphasis on some of these things has maybe to a lesser degree, but still very much their reverberations throughout churches across the U.S. So, for example, the charismatic movement of the kind of 1960s, 70s, that is very much downstream from this. So, like the Calvary Chapel movement comes out of the Jesus People movement. The leader of the Calvary Chapel movement spent 17 years training in the Foursquare Church, which was a Pentecostal denomination. And downstream from that, you get obviously the Calvary Chapel churches, also Vineyard churches are downstream from that as well. So, and even up to a lot of the kind of modern worship songs that we sing are from churches that are downstream from a lot of this. So it has these reverberating effects. Even if people don't leave a denomination to join a Pentecostal denomination, it's certainly impacting the way that other denominations are thinking about what it means to have the Holy Spirit and some of these things. Yeah.
Two things.
Yeah.
On the second page, when they were like waiting, it says like maybe the third sentence, like they laid aside all commentaries and notes and wait on the Lord. And then even later on in that chapter, or no, in the third paragraph there, people have nothing to do but wait on the Lord. Like just kind of we're just gonna wait and see what happens and pray for it. I thought was interesting. And also, I asked you last night about like what maybe the economic demographics would have been of the Second Great Awakening. Like would it mostly have been poor people? And I feel like at least for today, like you said, this was in a poor part of LA.
Yeah.
Like, and they're talking about the dirty floor and the people in the nice suits were like, I'm not gonna know this dirty floor.
Yeah.
And then even the Franciscans were going directly to the poor and the the sick. But just that it feels like there's, at least for the ones that we've looked at, this trend of like the poor or the poor in spirit are like seeking the Lord and finding Him.
Yeah. And I think even to this day, Pentecostalism is growing amongst the poorest countries typically. Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. So how does the Azusa Street Revival fit or not with our understanding of revival that we've been thinking about?
To your definitions, definitely fits to revival. We start, and to Grant's point, they've started saying these are the marks of what we think a revival is. Other than maybe just being sort of, to use a word, populist, there isn't really much in terms of, hey, this is going to actually impact society anyway from this, at least that I've seen. But it obviously does over the course of 120 years. I mean, this is the brand of Christianity that has gone to the poorer nations in the world. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, and there's a little less of that institutional focus, you're right, at least early on. Yeah.
It's prayer and devotion always as fundamental things to each.
Yeah.
And am I correct in understanding that they almost are seeing themselves as that first group of leaders as repeating Acts 1 as well? They're praying in the upper room.
In the upper room, yes. Yeah. They're taking that very literally of like, we're gonna gather just like they did in Acts 1 and expect what happened in Acts 2 to follow.
But there was no selling of all the possessions.
That is, yes.
Given to that poor. Did they? I wonder if they expected Acts 2:42 to 47 to happen as well.
As well.
You know,
No, that's a good question.
And in one respect, I mean, if you go to a Southern Baptist church, they may emphasize Acts 2:42 to 47 and be like Acts 2:1 through 41, other than the conversion of 3,000 people. You know, or at least let's say the first 20 verses before Peter's sermon, they're not as comfortable with that. The Pentecostal would be like, hey, I love this first part, you know.
I think that's a really good point.
You know, a lot of churches, like forward country, like in Haiti and Africa, even I heard, as you mentioned earlier, a lot of church, even Baptist church or what you probably consider like Reform, is in those places really influenced by Pentecostal and charismatic in some way, very like focused on prayer more than anything, prayer, devotion, and singing. You know, they'll come and spend great time like bowing their stomach, praying or sitting, and then sermon. Of course, they don't really have time limit in their services a lot of times.
Related to your question, you know, your definition is subjective in the sense that it does rely on the person to say, or a group of people to say, we've had this experience with the Lord. And then they use their own subjective experience. Pentecost has happened. Will you join? And that sort of argument, you know, actually is a part of it's a part of how some people will argue for certain things that we would call sin and all of that. So there is a real within the Pentecostal movement also. I mean, the health and wealth gospel is very commonly a byproduct of that.
Absolutely.
And again, that's kind of like, look how we've been blessed. And so when you make it, look what's happened. Obviously, God's doing this. So it's weird, right? Like Jesus says, anyone who says the work of the Spirit is the work of the devil, they're in danger. So I almost feel like I'm trapped between wanting to be a new light and an old light. Like I'm in danger of calling the Spirit of God's work evil. And at the same time, if you make your subjective experience of what the Spirit, if you make your subjective experience the arbiter of whether or not a work of the Spirit's happened, then you are in grave danger of actually saying, I can choose whatever I want to say. This is what God's doing. So it's really, this becomes by far the trickiest thing to kind of wrap our heads around.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think part of the reason I wanted to pick this case study as our final one is because it's one that's in a lot of ways still very live. I think Second Great Awakening, enough distance from that we're like, okay, it's not, there's no Second Great Awakening kind of thing happening. But Pentecostalism, yeah, it's very much debated, and people wrestle with what do we do with this today,
right?
So, yeah.
Also, too, Joe, I noticed like with every great leader who started a movement, like whether like Luther or Augustine or Francis Assisi, they always started with somehow kind of like experience. They have a aha moment or something just happened, kind of awakening them. And whether it's kind of subjective experience or not, but somehow God always uses it. Like, I don't know myself, I have an experience 2 years ago that completely changed how I read the Bible today. Even after I went to Moody and Wheaton for many years, and I started seeing the Bible differently, and then all of a sudden I'm reading those authors who sort of kind of like giving like me more kind of confirming on like, yeah, the way you're looking at it is pretty much sometimes I think Reformation always started. People sometimes you have to kind of have this kind of awakening, aha moment when God is about to move you to a different level and see things.
Yeah, and it's kind of like what Brandon mentioned yesterday of like any sort of revival or reformation is yes a group gathering, but each group is also made up of individual people who are wrestling with what does it look like for me to follow Jesus in this moment.
And let's say we got about 10 more minutes here.
Sounds good. Steve?
I carry some skepticism on the Pentecostal experience, the Holy Spirit, and I think one of the reasons, looking back, I carry some skepticism is because after I entrusted my life to Christ in the privacy of my own home, I publicly declared Christ in a Church of God in Christ Pentecostal church. And the fellow that they assigned me to mentor me was a nice enough fella, but on Sunday morning, every Sunday morning was like a Azusa Street revival. I mean, people were running around the church and speaking in tongues, and the music wouldn't stop, and it seemed like they were all wrapped up in this feeling thing. And I turned to the woman who was sitting next to me, and I said, "This really feels good." And she said, "We don't go by feelings, baby." And it was clear that they do. And so during this experience, somehow this guy who was assigned to me as a mentor dragged me, loosely speaking, up to the altar area. The music's going and people are speaking in tongues and folks are running around the church, and this is not unusual. And he's saying to me, "You can do it. You can do it." And he wants me to speak in tongues. And I didn't try, but I couldn't do it because that feeling had not overcome me. But I was in a great position to fake it, which I'm persuaded that a lot of people do, but by the grace of God, the wherewithal to think, if I fake it, how can I would say about a drug addiction, I was counting on my faith. If I fake it, how can I trust that my faith is real? And the assumption that I left that day with, and I only came back a couple of Sundays after that, the assumption that I left with was, subjectively, my own experience indicated that a lot of these people were faking it. And so I couldn't go back, because I know I had the sense that if you didn't fake it, and if you didn't wear a dark suit, I had on a blue jacket and different colored pants. If you didn't have a dark suit and you didn't fake it, is my word, if you didn't speak in tongues, then you may not really be don't know, Christian or a Christian of a higher level.
Yeah.
And so I received this with skepticism because all of my experience is overlaid on top of it. And I kind of understand that in 1906, 1907, there was no prior experience in this. So there may be some latitude in me to allow that experience for them didn't have the skepticism that I bring to it, but I struggle.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems like, I was thinking yesterday with the two examples we heard today, kind of on the spectrum of revival, if there is one, they seem very polar, right? Like one is so austere and one is so external and experiential. Yeah. And I wonder if there aren't other things that have been revivals where we've seen the movement of the Holy Spirit and people are repentant and lives are changed that aren't necessarily
at the poles.
Right, like
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and that was kind of intentional to kind of give us a little bit of whiplash in this way, to say, okay, well, let's go all the way over to this side and all the way over to this end and see.
Related to what Raquel's saying and the role of the Seymour question and what's the proper role of a prominent leader in times of revival, my understanding of the Asbury revivals, as people represent them now, and again, we're not far enough away from them to see the long-term effects. We've all heard about the 18 to 24-year-olds that are, especially male, that are at least interested in the church coming to all this. But there's not a clear set of leaders in this. In fact, that supposedly the chapel that kickstarted the whole thing was supposedly just a terrible sermon, or just like an average sermon. From a guy that was a chapel leader and kind of winged it.
Yeah.
Because he just wasn't as prepared. And so, by the way, just as a note, the humility, the William Seymour thing, it could be real. I don't know if any of you folks have ever seen like a music leader say, I'm not going to tell you my name because my name doesn't matter, or even like people that turn their face and turn their back to the audience and play while they're, I don't want you to focus on me. And it's just like, actually, you're drawing my attention to you more now by doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree with that. And yeah, like I said, the person who's giving us the account of that is someone who was a friend of Seymour's, so he's much more inclined to position it that way. Absolutely.
I think if anything, when I would staff middle school and when I was in my older days, we would do like discovery Bible study. We would read a passage and be like, okay, what do we learn about people? What do we learn about God? And then I forget, like, what do we learn about? There was one other thing, but just the I feel like both within the Franciscan movement and then this one and any other awakening, you have the reality of like sin being interwoven with it, and that so you get the compulsion to fake it or like to fit in. You get the like, oh, if you're married, like no more, like give it up kind of thing. Like just that there can be some of the humanity that ends up getting, and like Grant said, that there kind of became criteria in these ones specifically. Yeah. You start to get a little bit more of the human touch to it. Yeah. When in the end, but then you would hope and pray to it at the heart of it for the individual. There is like more so the God piece of it that He is working in the specific parts.
Yeah, so. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think in every authentic experience, there always gonna be someone who kind of like taking part. Even Paul, when he's talking in the New Testament, like in Corinthians, he noticed that he said, "Yeah, the Holy Spirit is among us; He's doing this work." But everyone want to speak in tongue because to them it's like the obvious way of showing like I am filled with the Holy Spirit, Yeah. And everyone started faking it, and Paul like, you don't have to speak in tongue to be filled with the Holy Spirit. It's not the only way.
Yeah. And that gets to something really important about the difference between these two. Going back to Raquel's point, St. Francis of Assisi didn't say we're going to bring Acts 2. Right. Whereas this is like, okay, Acts 2 is it. This is what we're after. Praying for that. And there is something to be said about, okay, God, I want this to happen again, or something like this to happen again. But then there's also the flip side. It's like, no, God, you're free. You get to lead however you so fit. Yeah. And so I think as we kind of, and we do really have maybe time for one or two more thoughts before I want to close this down. Yep. I do think as kind of put, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this weekend or tomorrow in the sermon, but I did want to say that it's important I do think as a church, if we wanted revival, I would rather us take the second approach, namely God, we'd like Acts 2 to happen, but you know, we're not all going to Jerusalem. There are people here that can speak a few different languages. You know, do what you want to do amongst us.
Yeah.
That's better.
Yeah.
I think more in line with our personal theology too. You know, which is.
And that does work according to culture. He doesn't kind of like always speaking of the culture, always within the culture, the way people think. That's how he works also. So that being the wisdom.
Yeah. Any last thoughts on that?
I'm processing this a lot. I personally have some problems with the AG church and have had to kind of reconcile myself to that as my brother has started going to an AG church. And I'm kind of with Steve on this. Like I struggle a lot with the speaking in tongues and the emphasis that Pentecostal churches put. And maybe we're just not far enough away from the Azusa Street revivals to see, but I struggle to see the same impact that other revivals have on culture in this one, right?
Yeah.
Where we see, with the one yesterday, we see prohibition come out of it, and abolition, and we you know with St. Francis, we see. You know, it's harder to fake what Francis was doing, right? You can't take that vow and then leave, right? Like you couldn't leave.
Yeah.
And so I wrestle a lot with this one, a whole lot more than the others.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is this our last discussion?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll just say I've been wrestling. What I'm gonna say is gonna make me sound very old-lightish, but I think I'm more like right in the middle. Like I feel very open to how God, yeah.
Dim light.
Dim light.
A dim light.
He's still in.
But not dim-witted.
Sorry.
No, but last night I think I was left with a question. I think looking at the kind of composite measure of people's the great churching, and then like the comment about millions of Bibles being sold. Like I kind of was left with the question of like, why should we care about the category of revival as Christians, and like specifically, does God care about it? So I'm clear that God cares that people know Him, and that He desires total worship. But I feel like there's been some scriptures I've been meditating on recently that I'm just going to share. One being in Isaiah 11 when it talks about the Messiah, that He doesn't judge by what His eyes see or decide disputes by what His ears hear, but with righteousness He shall judge the poor. And then in Jeremiah when it talks about the heart being deceitful and who can understand it, I, the Lord, search the heart and examine the mind to reward each person according to their conduct.
Yeah.
I think I always feel the tension of like, there's something only God can do and see that, but at the same time, if we are to be Christ-like, we're kind of called to use that same level of discernment. But I think we are naturally drawn to what our eyes see and ears hear, and I think in how we think about revival, a lot of it is related to like an affect and experience, and then numbers. And I don't always know that God is totally concerned with those things, because I think especially in the Old Testament, and this kind of gets at like the Frederick Douglass and Grimke type quotes. I was struck that like the Micah 6:8, which I feel like people are very familiar with, of He's told you, O man, what is good and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, love kindness, walk humbly. That before that, it's like a list of essentially worship things. Like, shall I come before the Lord and bow before myself, before God on high? Shall I come before Him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I bring my firstborn? And it's like it's very hyperbolic language. It's like, should we buy millions of Bibles? Should we fill a stadium? And then even like
what are you using number for exactly? You mean people? Or
Yeah, people, like the number, like last time we talked about like 20 to 30,000 people in the camps in the Second Great Awakening. And then even like Isaiah 1 talks about, like, have I had enough of burnt offerings? I do not delight in the blood of bulls or of lambs or of goats. And then when he gets to Jesus' words, especially in the Sermon on the Mount, like he's so fixated on the heart. And so I feel like a lot of times there's like a pressure to label like a discrete thing that's happening today as revival, but I feel like the things that God is most concerned with is like repentance and obedience. And those things are things that we are kind of inherently, as humans, limited in our ability to assess. And I think we go to the category of revival as it's like there's a potential to stumble in that we're looking for this when God really desires like a very pure worship that that produces an obedience that produces fruit as well.
I think that's a good thought, but I want to give you the last one, then I'm going to close this out.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. Yeah. My last thought will be an encouragement to continue in Ephesians, because I think one helpful way that like I mentioned yesterday, I view church history as family history. I also think it's helpful to keep in mind Paul's description of the church as a temple being built, full of people. And at my work currently, I send picture updates to my grandma of a skyscraper being built in the distance. And it's covered in this ugly yellow scaffolding, and they have cranes, and they have all sorts of stuff going on. And eventually, they're going to put some really nice shiny glass on the outside, and it's going to be beautiful and done. But right now, it's messy, doesn't have windows, doesn't have plumbing, whatever. And I think viewing church history, viewing the present as this kind of messy construction process that we aren't even totally sure exactly what is going to look like in the end, but we know that the person who has the blueprints is going to get done what he wills to get done, as I think something really helpful and encouraging to think about as we look backwards, as we look at our present, and as we look forward to what he's going to continue building. So that's kind of my closing thought.
Amen. Everybody give Joel a hand. I want to agree with Joel that everybody should be at a church talking about Ephesians, thinking about Ephesians. I want to say amen to that. But I think that...
Are you in there?
Sorry, I am not. I also want to make sure, I think Grant's thoughts are actually worth considering. I've got my own thoughts that I will be able to personally interact with him on. I do think that there is a great value in that question. And I think that instinctively that is basically right, with some caveats and buts that I would also put out there. For those of you that are thinking about this event and like, hey, I think all of us, my general impression is that this was meaningful, this was helpful. We would be looking to do something like this in May, June, that would be focused on equipping us for summer outreach, for summer hitting the city, hitting the streets again, something like that. And any thoughts you have about a speaker or someone who could lead that, let me know. I've got my own thoughts about something to do in September or October, and I'm going to ask somebody in this room to potentially lead that. I got my own idea. I got to talk to the elders first, but I do want to just let you folks know that. But any ideas I know Steve, I can speak for Craig, Steve, and Huge. Any ideas you folks have about this, please let us know. Feedback is so important to us, and we can't go and say, you folks know what you're thinking about, and the more you can actively tell us. This actually happened because of Craig's idea. We went through a few Moody professors that we were going to try to get to talk to us about issues about union with Christ, and Craig said, hey, what about Joel? And I said, yeah, Joel. Then I came up with the revival of the church history thing for him. So that's how that all worked. And believe me, there are plenty of things that we could do and to take opportunities for us to just be stretched in some areas that maybe, I know that there are things that you folks want to be talking about that we don't really have the right spaces or places for it just yet. And so this is one of those places and spaces that we can do that. So we want to be thinking through that. Kisney, why don't you pray us out?
Heavenly Father God, we thank you for today. Thank you, Father, for giving us the opportunity to come and hear Joel speak about revival and really show that we are part of a history that has been from the beginning. And with revival, we are still want revival to happen, but Lord Jesus, we want you to, like today, we ask that you come and bring Pentecost again among us in the way you want it to happen. and sometimes I know we tend to want to control things, but we pray that you control what you want to happen in our midst here in the U.S. and the world. Thank you again for Joel, and I pray that everyone who came here, who listened and hear what he has, I pray that it helped them to go closer and also see that they're part of a greater story. And in Jesus' name we pray.
Amen. Amen.